The cold came in through the church windows, slipping past the stained glass like an unwelcome guest who knew it would not be turned away. December in rural Pennsylvania carried a particular kind of chill, the sort that settled into bones and stayed there, patient and unmoved by whatever warmth people tried to summon against it. William Carter stood near the back of the First Presbyterian Church, his shoulders pressed against the wall, his hands folded in front of him in a posture that might have looked like prayer if anyone had been watching closely enough to care. No one was watching. The pews were full, 200 people, maybe more, packed into rows of dark wood that had held generations of the faithful and the merely obligated. The air smelled of lilies and furniture polish and the faint trace of perfume that women wore to funerals, because it seemed like the proper thing to do. At the front of the church, the casket sat closed and dignified beneath a spray of white roses. George Carter had been a prominent man in this town, owned the largest hardware supply business in 3 counties, sat on the school board for 20 years, never missed a Rotary Club meeting. The kind of man people spoke about in careful, measured tones, using words like respectable and fair and successful. Will did not know if any of those words were true. He supposed they might be. His father had certainly been successful by any metric that mattered to the people filling these pews. Money, property, influence. The things that made a man worth eulogizing on a Wednesday afternoon in the first week of December. The pastor was speaking now, his voice carrying that practiced tone of consolation that came from years of standing in front of grieving families. He spoke about George Carter's generosity, his commitment to the community, his dedication to family. We'll listen to the words without quite hearing them, the way you might listen to rain against a window, present but not requiring response. His older brother James stood at the front, shoulders straight, face composed in an expression of dignified sorrow. 50 years had been kind to James. Silver hair cut precisely, dark suit that probably cost more than Will made in a month. The bearing of a man who had spent his entire adult life convincing boardrooms and judges that he was someone worth listening to. He had given the first eulogy, spoke for 12 minutes about their father's legacy, about the values he instilled in his children, about the example he set. People nodded, some dabbed at their eyes. Patricia stood beside James, his older sister by 2 years. She wore black in that understated way wealthy women did, where the simplicity itself became a kind of statement. Her husband stood close, a hand resting at the small of her back. They had driven in from Philadelphia the day before, stayed at the Marriott in town because the family house, she had explained, felt too full of memories. Patricia had cried at appropriate moments during the service, small, controlled tears that did not disturb her makeup. David, the youngest of the 3 before Will, sat in the front pew with his wife and their 2 teenage children. He owned a real estate development company, made his money turning farmland into subdivisions with names like Meadowbrook Estates and Willow Ridge. He had not given a eulogy. When asked, he had demurred, saying he would not be able to get through it. People understood. Grief took different forms. Will had not been asked to speak. He told himself it did not matter. Told himself he had nothing to say that these people needed to hear. Told himself a lot of things standing there against the back wall while the pastor moved through the final prayers and the organist played something soft and somber that was probably meant to usher the departed into whatever came next. When the service ended, people stood slowly, gathering coats and purses, speaking in low voices. The family filed out first, forming a receiving line in the fellowship hall, where tables had been set with finger sandwiches and coffee in industrial urns. Will watched them go, watched the way people approached his siblings with hands extended, voices murmuring condolences. Watched the way James accepted each word with a slight nod, the way Patricia reached out to touch forearms and shoulders, the way David managed to look both bereaved and busy, as if even here he had somewhere more important to be. Will waited until the church was nearly empty before moving toward the side door. He had no interest in standing in a line accepting sympathy from people who would not recognize him if they passed him on the street. Outside, the December air hit sharper than it had inside. The sky stretched low and gray, threatening snow that had not yet decided to fall. Cars filled the parking lot, expensive sedans and SUVs that spoke of the kind of lives his father's friends had built for themselves. Will's truck sat at the far edge, a 10-year-old Ford with rust eating at the wheel wells and a passenger door that only opened from the inside. He had driven 3 hours that morning from the job site where he had been working, framing out a new addition on a house in Lancaster County. His boss had given him the day off without question when Will called to say his father had died. Told him to take the rest of the week if he needed it. Will had said one day would be enough. He reached his truck and stood beside it for a moment, keys in hand, looking back at the church. People were beginning to emerge, moving in clusters toward their vehicles. He should go back inside, should stand with his siblings, should accept the words people felt obligated to offer, should play the part of the grieving son. But his siblings had not asked him to stand with them, had not suggested he might want to be part of the receiving line, had not, in fact, spoken to him beyond the brief nods exchanged when he arrived that morning. There had been a time, years ago, when that might have hurt, when he might have felt the sting of exclusion like a physical thing. Now it just felt familiar, expected, the way things had always been. He got in the truck and started the engine. It turned over rough, complaining about the cold, but caught. He let it idle for a minute, warming up, watching through the windshield as his siblings emerged from the church. James first, speaking with the mayor. Patricia close behind, arm linked with her husband. David trailing, phone already to his ear. They had families, careers, lives that mattered in ways that could be measured and displayed. Will had a truck that barely ran, in a studio apartment above a garage 40 miles from anywhere he had ever called home. He put the truck in reverse and backed out of the space. The attorney's office sat on Main Street between an insurance agency and a barbershop that had been there since before Will was born. The building was old, red brick with tall windows that looked out onto a street lined with bare trees and parking meters. Will parked in front and sat for a moment, engine off, staring at the brass plaque beside the door. Mitchell and Sons, attorneys at law. Established 1953. He had received the call 3 days after his father died. A secretary with a kind voice explaining that Mr. Mitchell needed to see the family regarding the reading of the will. Could Mr. Carter make himself available Friday afternoon at 2 o'clock? Will had said yes because it seemed like the thing you were supposed to say, had not asked questions, had not really thought about what it meant. Now sitting in his truck with the December cold seeping through the doors, he thought about it. His father had been a careful man, meticulous, the kind of person who kept files organized and bills paid on time and never left anything to chance if he could help it. There would be a will. There would be instructions. There would be a plan for how to divide what he had spent his life accumulating. Will wondered briefly if he was included in that plan at all. He got out of the truck and went inside. The waiting room was small and warm, decorated in the style of a place that had not changed much since the 70s. Dark paneling, leather chairs worn soft at the armrests, a coffee table stacked with old issues of Field and Stream and Reader's Digest. His siblings were already there. James sat in one of the chairs, legs crossed, scrolling through his phone. Patricia stood by the window, looking out at the street. David leaned against the wall near the receptionist's desk, arms folded across his chest. They looked up when Will entered. James nodded once. Patricia offered a small, tight smile. David said nothing. Will took a seat in the corner, as far from the others as the small room allowed. No one spoke. The receptionist, a woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a chain around her neck, glanced at them occasionally from behind her desk, but did not attempt conversation. The silence stretched, broken only by the tick of a wall clock and the occasional buzz of James's phone. At 2 o'clock precisely, a door opened and Harold Mitchell stepped out. He was old, maybe 75, with thin white hair combed carefully across a spotted scalp. He had been the Carter family attorney for as long as Will could remember, had probably drafted his parents' wills decades ago, updating them periodically as circumstances changed. He greeted them each by name, shaking hands, offering condolences that sounded genuine in the way that came from long acquaintance. Then he gestured toward the open door. They filed into a conference room dominated by a long table of dark wood. Chairs were arranged on both sides. Mitchell took the seat at the head. James and Patricia sat to his right. David sat to his left. Will took the chair at the far end of the table, hands folded in front of him, eyes on the surface of the wood. Mitchell opened a folder and pulled out several documents. He put on reading glasses and cleared his throat. What followed was a recitation of assets and distributions. The language was formal, legal, almost soothing in its predictability. The family home, a Victorian at the north end of town with a wraparound porch and mature gardens, would be held jointly by James, Patricia, and David. They would decide among themselves whether to sell it or maintain it as a family property. The hardware business, which their father had sold 5 years earlier but retained stock in, would be divided equally among the three of them. The savings accounts, the investment portfolios, the retirement funds, all split three ways. Will listened without surprise. He had not expected anything different, had not, if he was honest, expected to be included at all. His siblings were the successful ones, the ones who had built careers and families and lives that reflected well on their father's legacy. It made sense to leave the meaningful assets to them. Mitchell turned a page, adjusted his glasses. Then there is the matter of the property at 1847 Hollow Ridge Road. Will looked up. The address meant nothing to him. Mitchell continued. This property, approximately 40 acres of forested land in the Allegheny Range, includes a two-story structure built in 1947. The property has been in the Carter family since that time, but has not been occupied for approximately 15 years. It is somewhat remote. Access is via an unmaintained road. There is no current electric or water service. He paused, looking down the table at Will. Your father has left this property in its entirety to William Carter. The words hung in the air. Will felt his siblings turn to look at him, felt the weight of their attention like something physical. Patricia spoke first. The hunting cabin? Mitchell nodded. Yes, though I believe it was used as a residence at one time. James leaned back in his chair. He was smiling, but it was the kind of smile that did not reach his eyes. The old place up in the mountains. I remember Dad talking about it. His father built it after the war. Patricia let out a small laugh, quickly covering it with her hand. Sorry, it has been condemned, hasn't it? I thought the county wanted to tear it down. Mitchell shuffled papers. There have been code violations noted, yes. The structure is in poor condition. David spoke for the first time, his voice flat. How poor? Mitchell glanced at the documents. The most recent inspection, conducted 3 years ago, noted significant structural damage. Roof failure. Foundation issues. The property was deemed uninhabitable. David looked at Will. So Dad left you a ruin? Mitchell cleared his throat. There is one additional condition attached to this bequest. He read from the document. William Carter must establish primary residence at the property for a period of no less than 6 consecutive months. Failure to meet this requirement will result in the property reverting to the county for public use. Silence filled the room. Then James laughed. It was a short, sharp sound. 6 months in a condemned cabin in the middle of winter. Patricia shook her head. That is not fair. Dad could not have been serious. Mitchell's expression did not change. I can assure you your father was quite specific about these terms. He returned to this document multiple times over the past 18 months to ensure the language was precise. David uncrossed his arms and leaned forward. Can we contest this? On the grounds that he was not of sound mind? Mitchell looked at him steadily. You can attempt to do so. However, I have documentation of multiple psychiatric evaluations conducted at your father's request, specifically to establish his competence at the time these documents were drafted. I suspect any contest would be unsuccessful. James stood, pacing to the window. This is absurd. Will cannot live up there. Look at him. He is. He trailed off, gesturing vaguely in Will's direction. He is what? Will asked quietly. James turned. I am trying to be realistic, Will. You work construction. You live in a studio apartment. You do not have the resources to survive 6 months in a place without electricity or running water. Dad knew that. This is either his idea of a joke or he was not thinking clearly. Will looked at Mitchell. Is there anything else? Mitchell reached into the folder and pulled out a sealed envelope. Heavy paper, yellowed slightly with age. On the front, in their father's handwriting, for William. Personal. He slid it across his table. Will took it, feeling the weight of it. Mitchell closed the folder. That concludes the reading of the will. If you have questions about the distributions, you may contact my office. If you wish to contest any portion of the will, you should seek independent legal counsel. He stood. They were being dismissed. James walked over to Will as he stood, envelope in hand. Look, he said, his voice taking on a tone of careful reasonableness. This does not have to be difficult. Sign over the property rights to us. We will handle the county, the demolition, whatever needs to be done. I can write you a check today. $5,000, cash. You can get a better apartment, maybe buy a newer truck. Will looked at his brother, at the expensive suit and the careful haircut, and the expression that suggested this was all very simple if Will would just be sensible about it. I will take my inheritance, Will said. Thank you. James's expression hardened. You are going to freeze to death in a week. Is your pride worth that? I guess we will find out. Patricia stepped closer, her voice softer. Will, we are trying to help you. You have to see how impossible this is. I see how it looks to you, Will said. But it is mine. He left it to me, not you. David had not moved from his chair. He spoke without looking up. Fine, let him try. When he comes crawling back in 2 weeks, we will still offer the 5,000, maybe less. Will walked to the door, turned back to look at them. Thank you for the offer, he said, but I will be staying. He left the office and did not look back. The drive took almost 2 hours. Main Street gave way to county roads, which gave way to state routes, which eventually narrowed into winding mountain roads that climbed higher with each mile. The pavement grew worse. Cracks became potholes. Smooth asphalt became rough patches. Then the pavement ended altogether and the road became gravel, loose and rutted, forcing Will to slow the truck to a crawl. Trees rose on both sides, dense and dark, pine and oak and maple, their branches bare against the gray sky. The afternoon light was already fading. December days were short this far north, and the mountains seemed to make them shorter still. David had insisted on following him in his BMW, said he wanted to see the place, wanted to make sure Will understood what he was getting into. Really, Will suspected, he just wanted to watch him fail. The road narrowed further. Branches scraped the sides of both vehicles. The gravel became dirt, then just 2 parallel ruts cutting through underbrush. Will could see David's headlights in the rearview mirror, could imagine his brother's expression as the BMW bottomed out on rocks and roots. Then the trees opened into a clearing, and there it was. The house stood slightly crooked, as if it had been built on ground that had shifted over the years and never quite settled back into place. 2 stories, wood siding that might once have been painted but now showed only bare gray weathered planks. The roof sagged in the middle, creating a gentle V that would collect water and snow and probably explain why parts of it had failed. One corner of the porch had collapsed, the posts rotting through, the boards tilted at an angle that looked almost deliberate, like modern art. Windows on both floors, but most of them broken or boarded over. The ones that remained intact were so dirty they looked black. Ivy climbed one wall, thick and tangled, holding on to wood that had gone soft with decay. The yard, if it could be called that, was overgrown with brush and small trees that had seeded themselves in the years since anyone last cleared the land. Will stopped the truck and sat looking at it. This was what his father had left him. This ruin, this impossible thing. David pulled up beside him and got out of the BMW, careful to avoid stepping in mud. He walked forward a few steps, hands in the pockets of his coat, and just stared. Jesus Christ, he said finally. Will got out of his truck. The air was colder up here, sharp and clean, and carrying the smell of pine and damp earth. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called. David turned to look at him. You cannot be serious. Will walked toward the house. The ground was uneven, covered in wet leaves that had been accumulating for years. He stepped onto what remained of the porch, testing his weight carefully. The boards creaked, but held. The front door hung slightly crooked in its frame. No lock, just an old latch that opened when he lifted it. The door scraped against the floor as he pushed it inward. Inside was worse. The main room was large and open, or had been once. Now it was filled with the debris of abandonment. Broken furniture. Stacks of old newspapers gone to pulp from water damage. Animal droppings. The smell of mold and rot. What had been a kitchen occupied one corner, the cabinets hanging open, the sink rusted through. Stairs led to the second floor, but several of the treads were missing and the railing had come away from the wall. Will stood in the doorway, taking it in. Behind him, he heard David's footsteps on the porch. This is what he gave you, David said. This is what you are choosing over $5,000 and common sense. Will did not answer. He was looking at the far wall, where stones had been mortared together to form what had once been a fireplace. The mantel was still intact. Dark wood, hand-carved with simple geometric patterns. Someone had built this. Someone had cared enough to make it beautiful. I am going back to town, David said. When you are ready to be reasonable, call me. But do not wait too long. Winter is coming, and you are not going to last a week in this place. Will heard him walk away. heard the BMW start and the sound of it backing down the narrow road, branches scraping metal, then silence, broken only by the wind moving through the trees and the creak of the house settling around him. He stood in that ruined room as the last light faded from the sky, stood there until he could barely see the shapes of things. Then he went back to his truck and pulled out his duffel bag and the box of supplies he had thrown together before leaving Lancaster County that morning. Carried them inside, found a corner of the main room where the floor looked solid and set them down. He had a sleeping bag, a camping lantern, some canned food, water bottles, a tarp, basic tools, not enough probably, but enough to start. Night came quickly in the mountains. By 6 o'clock, it was full dark. Will lit the lantern and set it on the floor. The light pushed back the darkness, but only barely, creating a small circle of visibility in a house that seemed to stretch away into shadows. He ate cold beans from a can sitting on the floor with his back against the wall. The temperature was dropping. He could see his breath. Through gaps in the walls, wind slipped in, patient and persistent. Somewhere above him, something moved. Mice, probably. Or squirrels. Maybe raccoons. The house had not been empty all these years. Nature had moved in to claim what people had abandoned. He thought about his siblings in their warm houses, thought about the funeral that morning, thought about his father's face, the few times he could remember it turning toward him with something other than disappointment or indifference. Could not remember many. Will had joined the Marines at 18 because it seemed like the only path that did not require proving anything to his family. Served 4 years, saw the desert, came home and worked construction because it was what he knew how to do. Married Karen when he was 30. Lost her to cancer when he was 53. In the 3 years since, he had worked and slept and worked some more, moving from job to job, town to town, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots or build anything resembling life. And now he was here, in a falling down house at the top of a mountain, because his father had left it to him, because his siblings had laughed, because something in him refused to be dismissed so easily. He pulled the sleeping bag around himself and lay down on the floor. The cold came up through the boards. Wind rattled loose siding. The house creaked and groaned, adjusting to the weight of his presence. He did not sleep for a long time. Morning came gray and grudging. Will woke stiff and aching, his breath clouding in the air. The lantern had died sometime in the night. He could hear birds outside, their calls sharp and insistent. He sat up slowly, his back protesting, and looked around the room. In daylight, it looked even worse. Water stains mapped the ceiling, holes in the walls, the floor sagging in places where joists had rotted through. It would take months to repair this, maybe longer, and that was if the structure was even salvageable. He stood and walked to the door, opened it, stepped out onto the porch. The cold hit like a physical thing. He guessed it was maybe 20 degrees. The sky stretched low and heavy with clouds that promised snow. He could leave, get in his truck, drive back to Lancaster County, call his boss and ask for his job back. Tell James to write the check, sign the papers. Let the county tear this place down and forget it ever existed. Should leave probably, but he did not. Instead, he went to his truck and pulled out the tools he had brought. A hammer, a pry bar, work gloves, a tarp. Started with the obvious. The broken windows, the holes in the roof, the collapsed corner of the porch. One thing at a time. Make it weather-tight, make it safe, make it livable. By midday, his hands were numb despite the gloves. He had pulled down rotted boards and tacked the tarp over the worst of the roof holes. Not a permanent fix, but better than nothing. Snow was starting to fall, light flakes that drifted down between the trees. He went inside and searched the basement. Found an old wood stove, cast iron, heavy as sin. Dragged it up the stairs one step at a time, muscles burning. Got it into the main room. There was a stovepipe still attached to the wall where a previous stove had been. He fitted it as best he could, knowing it was probably a fire hazard, knowing he did not have a choice. Needed heat or he would not survive the night. Found dry wood in a shed behind the house. Old lumber, probably left from some long-ago repair project. Stacked it near the stove. Lit a fire using newspaper and kindling. Watched the smoke rise up the pipe, praying it would draw. It did. Barely, but enough. Heat began to fill the room. Not much, not enough, but something. He ate another can of food, drank water that had started to freeze in the bottles, As the afternoon faded, he sat near the stove and pulled out the envelope Mitchell had given him, the one marked personal. He had not opened it yet, had been almost afraid to. But sitting there in the growing dark, in a house that seemed to be testing him with every breath, he broke the seal and unfolded the pages inside. His father's handwriting, neat and precise and somehow distant even on paper. "William," it began, "if you are reading this, you have not quit yet. I confess I am surprised. Your brothers were right to think this place would break you. It probably will, but there is a chance, small though it may be, that it will not. This house belonged to my father. Your grandfather, you never knew him. He died when you were 6. You probably do not remember him, but he built this place with his own hands in 1947, after he came home from the war. He was broken then. The Pacific Theater did things to men that they could not speak about, could barely live with. He came back to Pennsylvania and could not settle, could not sleep in a house with other people, could not stand the noise of town. So he bought this land, 40 acres in the mountains where no one would bother him, and he built this cabin, spent 2 years on it, did almost all the work himself. When it was finished, he lived here alone for 3 years before he met my mother. They married in 1950. I was born in 1951, raised here until I was old enough to leave. I hated this place, William, hated the isolation, hated the work, hated the way my father preferred silence to conversation. I left for college and never came back except to visit. Built my life in town, built my business, built what I thought success looked like. Your brothers and sister are successful by any measure that matters to the world. They have careers and money and respect. I gave them those things, or at least I gave them the tools to get those things. I am proud of what they have become. But you, William, you were always different. Never wanted what they wanted. Never fought for my approval the way they did. I thought that meant you did not care, thought it meant you were weak. I was wrong. When your mother got sick, you came. Gave up your job. Gave up your life. Moved back to take care of her. Your siblings sent cards and called on weekends, but you were there. Every day. Every night. When she died, you stayed. Took care of me when I got sick. When I could not drive anymore, you drove me. When I could not manage the stairs, you moved me to the first floor. You never complained, never asked for anything. Your brothers and sister are successful, but you are the only one who knows how to give, and that is worth more than anything I could leave in a will. This house is falling apart. It will be hard to fix, maybe impossible. The county wants to tear it down. Your siblings think I am punishing you by leaving it to you. Maybe I am. Or maybe I am giving you the only thing that ever mattered to my father and the only thing I never understood. A place to be broken. A place to build yourself back. A place where no one will judge you and nothing is required except showing up. 6 months, William. If you can make it 6 months, this place is yours. Do with it what you want. Fix it or burn it down. But stay, because I think you need this. I think you need to find out who you are when everything else is stripped away. I am sorry I never told you this while I was alive. I am sorry for a lot of things. But mostly I am sorry I never saw you for who you were. The strongest of all my children. The one who knew how to endure. Your father. Will read the letter twice. Then a third time. Folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope. He sat staring into the fire, feeling something shift inside him. Not clarity, not peace, but understanding. Faint and fragile, but there. His father had not given him a ruin. He had given him a question. Are you strong enough? Are you stubborn enough? Will you quit or will you stay? Night fell around the cabin. Snow continued to fall, silent and steady. The fire burned low. Will added more wood, watching the flames catch and grow. His body ached, his hands were cracked and bleeding. The house creaked in the wind like something alive. He wrapped himself in the sleeping bag and lay down near the stove. Closed his eyes. Listened to the mountains settling around him. Did not leave. The days blurred together. Monday became Tuesday, became Wednesday. Or maybe it was the other way around. Will lost track. Time moved differently up here. Measured not by clocks, but by light and dark. By the temperature. By how much wood remained stacked by the stove. He worked from dawn until he could not see anymore. Worked until his muscles screamed. Worked until exhaustion was the only thing he could feel. Pulled down rotten boards. Nailed tarps over holes. Cleared debris. Reinforced floor joists that had started to give way. The cold was constant. At night it dropped below zero. He woke to frost on the inside of the windows, to water frozen solid in the bottles. The fire never went out completely, but it barely kept the main room above freezing. The rest of the house was Arctic. He lost weight, 8 pounds the first week, could feel his body consuming itself for fuel. The food he had brought was running low, would need to go into town soon, face people, face questions, face the looks that would tell him everyone knew he was up here trying to do something impossible. On the 8th day, he was on the roof trying to patch his section that had started leaking directly over the stove. The ladder he had found in the shed was old and uncertain, the rungs bending under his weight. He was hammering shingles when he heard the sound of an engine. He stopped, listened. Definitely a truck, coming up the road. He climbed down carefully and walked around to the front of the cabin. A pickup emerged from the trees. Old Chevy, maybe older than Will's Ford. It stopped and an elderly man got out. He was maybe 70, dressed in canvas work clothes and a heavy jacket, moved like someone who had spent his life doing physical labor. His face was weathered, lines cut deep around his eyes and mouth. He studied Will for a moment without speaking. "You are George Carter's boy," he said finally. "Yes, sir," Will said. "I am Frank Holloway. Knew your grandfather. Worked with him at the mill." Will waited. The man walked forward a few steps, looking past him at the cabin. "Your dad came to me 3 months before he died. Said if you actually stayed, I should give you this." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a sealed envelope. Heavy paper, yellowed. On the front, in his father's handwriting, "William, only if you make it to day 10. Will took it, feeling the weight. His hands were shaking. From the cold, he told himself. Just the cold. Frank nodded once, turned and walked back to his truck. Got in, started the engine. "Wait," Will called. Frank looked at him through the open window. "What is in it?" Frank considered for a moment. Only one way to find out. He drove away, disappearing back down the road. Will stood in the snow, envelope in hand, wind cutting through his coat, looked down at his father's handwriting. Day 10, tomorrow would be day 9. He had almost made it. He went inside, built up the fire, sat on the floor with the envelope in his lap as darkness came down around the cabin. Outside, the wind picked up, snow fell harder. The temperature dropped. Will stared at the envelope, thought about his siblings and their warm houses, thought about the life he had left behind, thought about the 8 days he had survived in this place that was trying its best to break him. Tomorrow, he thought, tomorrow I will open it. But as the fire burned low and the cold pressed in and the house creaked around him like something breathing, he broke the seal, unfolded the pages, and began to read what his father had hidden until he earned the right to know. The paper felt thin between Will's fingers, fragile in a way that made him careful as he unfolded it. The handwriting was his father's, but looser than the first letter, as if written quickly or in a state of emotion that did not allow for the usual precision. The date at the top read August, 3 months before his father died. "William," it began, "you made it past the first week. That means something. Most men would have left by now. Your brother certainly would have. I am not sure what that says about you. Stubbornness, maybe, or strength. The difference is hard to see from the outside. I need to tell you about this house, about why it matters. Not to me, though it does. To your grandfather." Thomas Carter came back from the war in the Pacific in 1946. He was 24 years old. He had seen things no man should see, done things he could not speak about. The war did not end for him when the fighting stopped. It followed him home, lived in his head, made sleep impossible and silence unbearable and crowds something to avoid. He tried to settle back into normal life, worked at the mill with the other men who had come back, but he could not do it, could not sit at dinner tables and pretend everything was fine, could not make small talk about weather and baseball and the price of lumber. Everything felt hollow. Everything felt wrong. So he bought this land, 40 acres at the top of a mountain where no one would bother him, where he could not hear traffic or voices or any of the sounds that reminded him there was a world full of people going about their lives like nothing had happened, like the world had not just torn itself apart. He built this cabin with his own hands, spent 2 years on it, cut the timber himself from trees on the property, hauled stones from the creek bed for the foundation and the fireplace. Did the work slowly, deliberately, because the work was the point, not the finished house. The work itself. Your grandmother told me once that those 2 years saved his life. That building this place log by log, stone by stone, was the only thing that kept him from walking into the woods one day and not coming back. The work gave him something to do with his hands while his mind healed, or tried to heal. I am not sure it ever did completely. When the cabin was finished, he lived here alone for 3 years, just him and the mountain. Then he met your grandmother at a church social in town. She was a teacher, quiet, patient, willing to love a man who needed more silence than most people could stand. They married in 1950. I was born a year later. I grew up here, William, in this house you are standing in now, and I hated every minute of it. I hated the isolation, hated that we did not have what other families had, hated that my father preferred working with his hands to working with his mind, hated that he seemed content with so little when the world had so much more to offer. I left for college as soon as I could, came back only for holidays, built my life in town, built my business, married your mother, had you and your brothers and sister, gave you all the things I never had. Education, opportunity, comfort. But I never gave you what my father gave me. This place, this silence, this chance to find out who you are when everything else is stripped away. He died when you were 6. Heart attack. Quick, I sold this property to a cousin who promised to maintain it. He did for a while, then he did not. It sat empty for 30 years. I bought it back 5 years ago when the cousin died and his children wanted nothing to do with it. Paid more than it was worth. Your mother asked me why. I could not explain it then. I am not sure I can explain it now. But when I got sick, when I knew I was dying, I kept thinking about this place, about my father, about the choice he made to build something with his hands instead of destroying himself, about the fact that I spent my whole life running from what he built and never found anything better. I am leaving this to you because you are the only one who might understand, the only one who does not need the world to tell you that you matter, the only one who knows how to be alone without being lonely. 6 months, William. Live here, work on it. Let it teach you what it taught my father, what I was too proud to learn. There is something else, something I need to tell you, but you are not ready yet. You will know when you are. When that time comes, look under the hearthstone. The original one, not the fireplace you can see now. That was rebuilt in 1963. The original hearthstone is outside. My father moved it when he renovated. Used it as the foundation for the back steps. You will find what you need there. I am sorry I could not say these things to your face. I am sorry for a lot of things. But mostly I am sorry I never learned what my father tried to teach me. That a man's worth is not in what he owns or what he achieves. It is in what he builds, what he gives, what he endures. Be well, son. Be strong. And when you want to quit, remember that wanting to quit and actually quitting are two different things. Your father, Will, read the letter 3 times, then sat holding it, staring into the fire. Outside, wind moved through the trees. Snow fell steady and silent. The cabin creaked around him like something breathing. He thought about his grandfather, a man he barely remembered, vague impressions of rough hands and a quiet voice. A man who sat on the porch in the evening smoking a pipe, who taught him how to hold a hammer, who died before Will was old enough to understand what war did to people. And he thought about his father, the distance that had always been there, the sense that nothing Will did would ever be quite enough, the careful praise that felt more like obligation than pride. All of it may be rooted in this place, in a childhood spent in isolation, in a father who could not explain why silence mattered more than success. Will folded the letter and put it back in the envelope, put both envelopes together and tucked them into his jacket. The fire was burning low again. He added wood, watched the flames catch. Tomorrow would be day 9, then day 10, then day 11. Each one a small victory over the cold and the doubt and the voice in his head that said this was pointless. He lay down on the floor near the stove and pulled the sleeping bag around himself. Closed his eyes, did not sleep for a long time. Morning came with Frank Holloway's truck. Will heard it before he saw it, the sound of the engine carrying through the still air. He got up, stiff and aching, and walked to the door. Opened it to see Frank getting out of the cab, the truck bed loaded with lumber and tools. Frank walked toward the cabin without greeting, looked up at the roof, then at Will. Figured you might need help, he said. Will did not know what to say to that. stood there in the cold with his breath clouding and his hands already going numb. Frank gestured at the truck. Got some salvaged 2x4s, some shingles from a barn tear down last month. Not pretty, but they will keep water out better than that tarp. Will found his voice. I cannot pay you. Frank looked at him with an expression that might have been amusement. Did not ask you to. He walked back to the truck and started unloading boards. Will watched for a moment, then went to help. They worked in silence, carrying lumber to the cabin, stacking it near the door. When the truck was empty, Frank pulled out a thermos and 2 tin cups, poured coffee, handed one to Will. They stood in the snow, drinking it. The coffee was black and strong and so hot it burned going down. Will could not remember anything tasting better. Your grandfather and I worked together at the mill for 20 years, Frank said. He was foreman. I was just a sawyer, but he treated everyone the same. Fair, respectful, did not care if you had a college degree or could barely read. If you did your work, he respected you. He paused, looking out at the trees. He saved my life once. I was working the big saw, got distracted, did not see a piece of wood kick back. Would have taken my head off. He grabbed me, pulled me back, broke his arm doing it. Never said a word about it after. Just went to the hospital, got a K2S, came back to work the next day. Will listened without speaking. When he died, Frank continued, I went to the funeral. Your dad was there, gave a nice speech, talked about his father's dedication to family, his work ethic, all the right words. But I could tell he did not mean them. Could tell he was ashamed of where he came from. Of this place. Frank looked at Will. Your dad came to see me 3 months before he died. Sat in my kitchen and told me about this cabin, about leaving it to you. Asked me if I thought you would stay. What did you tell him? Will asked. Told him I did not know you well enough to say, but I knew your grandfather. And if you were anything like him, you would stay until the mountain was done with you. What does that mean? Frank finished his coffee and poured the dregs onto the snow. Means the mountain decides when you leave. Not you, not your family. When it is finished teaching you what you need to know, you will know. He picked up a hammer from the truck bed and held it out to Will. Until then, we work. They worked through the morning and into the afternoon. Frank showed Will how to tear out rotten sections of roof without bringing down the whole structure. How to fit new boards so they would hold against wind and snow. How to drive nails at an angle to get better purchase in old wood. He did not talk much, just demonstrated and expected Will to follow. Will's hands were clumsy with cold and inexperience. He bent nails, missed strikes, had to pull out boards he had just put in because they were not seated right. Frank never criticized, just waited while Will did it again and again until it was right. By evening, they had replaced a section of roof maybe 10 feet square. Not much, but it was solid, would hold. Frank gathered his tools and put them back in the truck. I will come back tomorrow if the weather holds, he said. Bring more materials. Why are you doing this? Will asked. Frank considered the question. Because your grandfather would have. Because your father asked me to look after you if you stayed. Because it is the right thing to do. He got in his truck and drove away, leaving Will standing in the snow as darkness came down around the cabin. The days fell into a pattern. Frank arrived every morning just after dawn. They worked until the light failed. Sometimes Frank brought materials, sometimes just tools, sometimes just himself and the knowledge of how to make broken things whole again. Will learned by doing, learned that the work required patience more than strength, that rushing led to mistakes and mistakes cost time and materials they could not afford to waste. Learned to read wood by its grain and color, to know which boards would hold and which would split under pressure. Learned the rhythm of hammer and saw, the satisfaction of a joint that fit tight, the quiet pride in a section of roof that no longer leaked. His body changed. The softness that had come from 3 years of grief and grief eating fell away. Muscles developed across his shoulders and back, his hands calloused over, the skin thickening until it no longer split at every cold touch. He moved differently, slower, more deliberate, like someone learning to inhabit his body instead of just using it. The cabin changed too. Slowly, section by section, they replaced most of the roof, patched the walls, reinforced the floor, installed a better stovepipe that drew properly. It was still rough, still far from comfortable, but it was becoming weather-tight, becoming safe. At night, Will sat by the fire and reread the letters from his father. Thought about his grandfather building this place log by log. about the war that had broken him and the silence that had saved him, about his own brokenness, the grief he had carried since Karen died, the sense that he had been disappearing a little more each day until there was barely anything left. The work gave him something to do with that grief. Let him pour it into the physical. Let exhaustion replace thought. Let sleep come without dreams. On the 14th day, Frank brought supplies from town. Nails, more lumber, a bag of groceries because Will had mentioned running low on food. They were working on the porch when Frank paused, hammer in hand, and looked at Will. "People in town are talking about you," he said. Will stopped working. "What are they saying?" "That George Carter's son is living up in the old place. That you are trying to fix it. Some think you are crazy. Some think it is admirable. Your brothers came through last week asking questions." Will felt tension settle in his chest. What kind of questions? About the property. About whether it was safe. Whether the county should intervene. Frank hammered another nail, then looked up. "They filed a complaint with the building inspector. Said the structure is a danger and should be condemned." Will set down his tools. "Can they do that?" "They can try. Inspector has to come look. Make an assessment. If he agrees it is unsafe, he can order you to vacate. Can order the county to tear it down." Will felt something cold settle in his stomach. "When?" "Do not know. Could be next week. Could be next month. But you should be ready." They worked in silence after that, the easy rhythm disrupted by knowledge that time was not on their side, that his siblings were not going to wait 6 months and accept whatever happened. They were going to fight, were going to use the system to force him out before he could finish what he started. That night, Will walked the property line in the dark, just to move, just to think. The snow had stopped, but the cold remained, sharp and clean. Stars scattered across the black sky, more visible here than he had ever seen them in town. The kind of stars his grandfather must have looked at, must have found some comfort in. He thought about quitting, about calling James and accepting whatever offer still stood, about walking away before the county came and forced him out. It would be easier, simpler, less painful than fighting a fight he probably could not win. But something kept him standing there in the cold looking up at those stars. Something stubborn. Something that did not know how to quit even when quitting was the smart choice. He went back inside, added wood to the fire, lay down and slept. Frank came back the next day with news. The building inspector was scheduled to visit in 2 weeks, would do a full assessment. Frank had talked to him, knew him from years of work around the county. The inspector was fair but by the book. If the structure violated code, he would have no choice but to condemn it. 2 weeks, Will said. 2 weeks to make it look like something the county will not tear down, Frank agreed. They worked harder after that. Longer days. Frank showed Will how to shore up the foundation where stones had shifted, how to sister new joists alongside rotted ones to reinforce the floor, how to make repairs that would pass inspection even if they were not pretty. Will's body protested. Muscles that had grown strong now pushed past their limits. His back ached constantly. His hands bled through the calluses. He lost more weight, could feel his clothes hanging looser, could see his face in the cracked mirror showing angles that had not been there before. But the work got done. The cabin began to look less like a ruin and more like a structure someone actually lived in. Windows replaced, walls patched, floor solid underfoot. The inspector would still find violations, but maybe not enough to justify tearing it down. Maybe. On the 18th day, Will was on a ladder working on the second story when he heard a vehicle coming up the road. Not Frank's truck. Something else. He climbed down and walked around to the front just as a silver BMW pulled into the clearing. David got out, followed by a woman in professional clothes carrying a clipboard. She looked around with an expression that was carefully neutral. David looked satisfied. "Will," David said, "this is Sarah Chen from the county planning office. She is here to do a preliminary inspection." Will wiped his hands on his pants. "The inspection is not scheduled for another week." Ms. Chen stepped forward. "Mr. Carter, I am just here to assess the situation. Make some notes. The formal inspection will still happen as scheduled." She walked toward the cabin. Will followed. David stayed by his car, arms crossed, watching. Ms. Chen moved through the structure methodically, made notes on her clipboard, asked questions about permits, about electrical, about plumbing. Will answered as honestly as he could. There were no permits because he had not known he needed them. There was no electrical because there was no power line. There was no plumbing because the well had gone dry years ago and he was hauling water from the creek. She made more notes. Her expression gave nothing away. When she finished, she walked back outside where David waited. "Preliminary assessment will be in my report," she said to Will. "The inspector will review it before his visit. Thank you for your cooperation." She got in her car and drove away. David lingered. "You are wasting your time," he said. "The county is going to condemn this place and you know it." "Maybe," Will said. "Definitely. And when they do, you will have spent a month freezing in the woods for nothing." He shook his head. "I almost feel sorry for you, Sho." "You do not have to feel anything for me," Will said quietly. "You can just leave." David smiled. "That is exactly what I am going to do. And in a few weeks, you will too." He got in his BMW and left. Will stood in the clearing, watching the space where the car had been. Felt anger rise hot and sharp. Not at David, at himself for caring what David thought, for letting it get under his skin. Frank arrived an hour later, took one look at Will's face and knew. "They came," he said. Will nodded. Frank set down his tools. "Then we keep working. Make it impossible for them to say no." They worked until dark, then worked by the light of the lantern, finished the last of the roof repairs, sealed the worst of the wall gaps, made the cabin as weathertight as it could be given the time and materials they had. When Frank finally left that night, Will sat by the fire too tired to move. His body had passed exhaustion hours ago, was now running on something else. Stubbornness, maybe, or spite. Hard to tell the difference. He thought about what his father had written, about his grandfather building this place as a way to heal from what war had done to him, about work being the point, not the finished product, about endurance mattering more than success. Will understood that now. The cabin was not the point. Fixing it was not the point. The point was showing up every day, doing the work, not quitting even when quitting made sense. That was what his father had wanted him to learn, what his grandfather had learned 70 years ago on this same mountain. He lay down near the fire and sleep came quick and heavy. The next morning, Will woke to find Frank's truck already in the clearing. He got up and went outside to find Frank unloading more lumber. But this time he was not alone. 3 other men were with him, all older, all dressed for work. Frank saw Will and gestured. "These are some boys from town. Heard you might need help getting ready for inspection." The men nodded, introduced themselves. Names Will tried to remember and failed. They did not seem to mind, just picked up tools and got to work. They spent the day finishing details, replacing broken windows, patching the last holes in the walls, cleaning debris from around the foundation. The men worked without much conversation, just the easy rhythm of people who had done this kind of work their whole lives. At lunch, they sat on the porch eating sandwiches one of them had brought. The oldest of the group, a man named Tom, who must have been pushing 70, looked at Will. "Your grandfather was a good man," he said. "Gave my dad a job at the mill when no one else would. Depression was hard. My dad could not read or write. Your grandfather did not care, just cared if he could work." Another man nodded. "My uncle worked for him too. Said he was fair, paid on time, treated everyone with respect." Will listened, learned things about his grandfather he had never known. Small stories, moments of kindness or fairness or simple decency. The picture that emerged was of a man who understood hardship, who did not judge people by their education or their past, who gave second chances. The kind of man his father had run from, had been ashamed of, had spent his whole life trying not to be. They worked until sunset. The cabin looked better than it had in years, maybe better than it had ever looked. The men gathered their tools, said quiet goodbyes, drove away into the gathering dark. Frank stayed after they left, stood with Will looking at what they had accomplished. "That should do it," Frank said. "Inspector comes next week. If he condemns it after all this, he is not looking at the same structure we are." Will felt something loosen in his chest, something he had been holding tight without realizing it. "Thank you. I could not have done this without you." Frank looked at him. "You would have found a way. You are more stubborn than your grandfather, and he was the stubbornest man I ever met." He started toward his truck, then stopped. "Almost forgot. Your dad wanted me to tell you something if you made it to 3 weeks." Will waited. "He said to look for the journal. Your grandfather kept one, wrote in it almost every day for 40 years. Your dad found it after your grandfather died but never read it. Could not bring himself to. He left it here somewhere, said you would know where to look when you were ready." "Where is it?" Frank shrugged. "Your dad did not tell me. Said you would figure it out." He got in his truck and drove away. Will stood in the cold, wondering what else his father had hidden in this place. What else he was supposed to find. He went inside and searched, looked in the obvious places first, closets, cabinets, under the stairs, found nothing, expanded the search, pulled up loose floorboards, checked behind wall panels, went through the basement inch by inch. Still nothing. It was past midnight when he gave up. Sat by the fire exhausted and frustrated. His father's letter had mentioned the hearthstone, the original one, outside used as the foundation for the back steps. Maybe the journal was there too. He got a flashlight and went out into the cold. The back of the cabin faced the woods. The steps were just 3 flat stones leading from the door to the ground. He knelt and examined them by flashlight. The top stone was newer. The bottom 2 were old, weathered, moss growing in the cracks. He worked the pry bar under the bottom stone and levered it up. It moved reluctantly, scraping against frozen ground. Underneath was dirt and roots and insects that scattered from the light. No journal. He tried the middle stone. Same result, just dirt and darkness. Frustration built. He sat back on his heels, breath clouding in the cold. Maybe Frank had been wrong. Maybe his father had been mistaken. Maybe there was no journal. Maybe it was lost or destroyed or never existed in the first place. Then he noticed something. The stones were not quite level. The bottom one sat slightly higher on one side, as if something underneath was pushing it up. He worked the pry bar deeper, felt it catch on something that was not dirt or root. He pried harder. The stone shifted. Underneath, wrapped in oilcloth, was a package the size of a book. Will pulled it out carefully, unwrapped the oilcloth in the glow of the flashlight. Inside was a leather journal, the cover cracked and stained but intact. He opened to the first page. Thomas Carter, January 1947. His grandfather's handwriting. Careful, precise. The handwriting of someone who had learned to write as an adult and never quite made it automatic. Will closed the journal and rewrapped it, went back inside, built up the fire, sat with the journal in his lap, staring at the cover. This was what his father had left for him to find. His grandfather's words. His grandfather's life. The story of this place and the man who built it and why it mattered enough to save. He opened the journal and began to read. The first entries were sparse. Notes about the land purchase, measurements for the foundation, lists of materials needed, the practical details of someone planning a construction project. But as the entries continued, they changed, became less about the work and more about why the work mattered. March 1947. Cannot sleep again. The dreams are worse at night. During the day, I can keep my hands busy and the memories stay back. But night is when they come. I see faces, hear sounds, smell things that are not there. This land is quiet. No voices, no traffic, no reminders. Maybe that will help. Maybe building something will help. Have to try. April 1947. Started the foundation today. Hauled stones from the creek. Every stone I set feels like something. Like I am building a wall between who I was and who I need to become. The work is hard, but that is good. Exhaustion is better than memory. June 1947. The walls are going up. Slow work. My hands are not used to this, but they are learning. Met a man in town who asked what I am building. Told him a house. He asked why so far from everything. Told him I like the quiet. He looked at me like he understood. Maybe he was in the war too. Maybe he has his own reasons for wanting quiet. Will read entry after entry. Watched his grandfather's life take shape through sparse sentences and careful observations. The loneliness of those early years. The struggle to build something meaningful out of darkness. The slow recognition that the work itself was the healing, not the finished product. September 1947. The roof is on. The house is weather-tight. Winter is coming and I will be ready for it. For the first time since I came home, I feel like I might survive this. Not just physically. The war tried to kill something in me that bullets could not reach. This house is teaching me that thing is still alive. Buried, maybe. Damaged. But not gone. Will read until the fire burned low. Read about his grandfather meeting his grandmother. About their marriage. About the birth of Will's father. About the choice to raise a family in this isolated place. About the years of work at the mill. The quiet accumulation of a life. And then, in 1965, an entry that made Will stop. George left for college today. He is ashamed of this place. ashamed of me. I see it in his eyes. He wants more than I could give him, more than this mountain, more than the quiet I built here. I do not blame him. Every man has to find his own way, but I hope someday he understands. That success is not about what you have. It is about what you can endure, what you can build when everything else is stripped away. Will closed the journal, sat staring into the dying fire. His father had spent his whole life running from this place, running from his father's choices, building a different kind of success. And in the end, he had left this cabin to the one son who might understand what his own father had been trying to teach him. That endurance mattered more than achievement, that knowing who you are mattered more than proving what you can do, that sometimes the greatest success is just surviving what tries to break you. Will wrapped the journal carefully and set it aside, lay down near the fire. Tomorrow the inspector would come, would decide whether this place stood or fell, whether Will's month of work meant anything, or was just time wasted in the cold. But tonight, reading his grandfather's words, Will felt something he had not felt in years. Not hope exactly, something steadier. The sense that he was exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what he needed to do, not for his father or his siblings or anyone else. For himself, he closed his eyes and slept without dreams. Morning came with a different sound. Not Frank's truck, but something heavier. Will woke and looked out to see the county inspector's vehicle pulling into the clearing. Behind it, David's BMW. Of course David would be here, would want to watch this. Will got up and went outside. The inspector was a man in his 50s, carrying a clipboard and wearing a county jacket. He nodded to Will. "Mr. Carter, I am here for the inspection." Will nodded. "The structure is ready." They walked through the cabin together. The inspector was thorough, checked every repair, tested floors, examined roof structure, made notes on his clipboard. David followed at a distance, saying nothing but watching everything. It took 2 hours. When it was finished, the inspector stood in the main room looking around. "You have done a lot of work here," he said. "Yes, sir," Will replied. The inspector made a final note. "This structure still has violations. No septic system, no electrical inspection, no permits for the work that was done." Will waited. "But," the inspector continued, "it is structurally sound. The roof is solid. The foundation is adequate. It is not a danger to anyone." He looked at Will. "I am not going to recommend demolition, but you will need to bring it up to code within 6 months if you want to continue residing here long term. That means permits, inspections, proper systems." Will felt something release in his chest. "I understand." The inspector nodded. "Good luck, Mr. Carter." He left. David stayed behind, standing in the clearing with his hands in his pockets. "You got lucky," he said. "Maybe," Will replied. David shook his head. "This is not over. We are contesting the will." James found an attorney. "We are going to prove Dad was not competent when he wrote it." "You do what you need to do," Will said. "I will be here." David looked at him for a long moment, then got in his car and drove away. Will stood in the clearing after he left, stood in the cold morning air looking at the cabin. It was still rough, still far from finished, but it was standing, and so was he. Frank's truck appeared an hour later. He got out and walked over. "Heard the inspector did not condemn it," he said. "No," Will confirmed. 6 months to bring it to code, but he is letting it stand. Frank nodded. "That is good. That is real good." They stood together in the quiet. "Your grandfather would be proud," Frank said. "Your dad too, I think." Will did not know about that, but he knew he was proud of the work, of not quitting, of making it this far. "There is still a lot to do," Will said. "Always is," Frank agreed. "But you have got time now. 6 months. Maybe more." Will looked at the cabin, at the mountain, at the trees stretching away in every direction. For the first time since arriving, he let himself imagine staying. Not just for 6 months, but longer. Building a life here, making this place his own. The thought did not frighten him the way it might have a month ago, did not feel like exile. Felt like possibility. He turned to Frank. "Thank you for everything." Frank waved a hand. "We are not done yet. Still got a lot of work ahead." He got back in his truck and drove away. Will went inside, built up the fire, opened his grandfather's journal and kept reading, learning, understanding. Outside, winter settled deeper over the mountain, but inside, something was beginning to thaw. The journal became Will's companion through the long winter nights. He read it by firelight, page by careful page, learning his grandfather through words written in solitude. Most entries were brief, notes about the weather, about work at the mill, about small repairs needed around the cabin. But scattered through the practical observations were moments of something deeper. Reflections on the war, on silence, on the slow process of becoming whole again. February 1952. George is walking now, gets into everything, finds joy in the simplest things. A stick, a stone, the way light moves across the floor. I watch him and wonder what memories he will carry from this place. Will he remember the quiet? Or will he, like me at his age, want nothing more than to escape it? Will turned the pages carefully. The leather was dry, cracking at the spine. Some entries had faded, the ink gone pale with time. He filled in the missing words from context, from understanding. March 1959. The company men came again today. Offered twice what they offered last year. They want the spring. Say the water is the cleanest in 3 counties. Could make a fortune bottling it. Told them the same thing I told them before. Some things are not for sale. They were not happy. Said I was being foolish. Maybe I am. But this water kept me alive when I first came here. Seems wrong to sell it to people who will put it in plastic bottles and ship it away. Will stopped reading. Read the entry again. The spring, water rights. He thought about his father's letter, about looking under the hearthstone, about something hidden, something valuable. He had found the journal there, but his father had said there was more. Something Will would need, something that mattered. He kept reading, looking now for any mention of the spring, of the company, of what his grandfather had been protecting. April 1959. They are persistent. Sent a lawyer this time instead of company men. Explain that I do not own the water, just the land. That spring rights can be separated from surface rights. That I should consult my own attorney. I told him I understood perfectly well what I own and what I do not. He left papers anyway. Legal documents I cannot make sense of. Put them somewhere safe. Maybe George will need them someday. Will close the journal. Somewhere safe. The same place as the journal. Under the hearthstone. He went outside with a flashlight in the pry bar. The night was cold and clear. Stars scattered thick across the black sky. He knelt at the back steps where he had found the journal and worked the stones up one by one. Searched the cavities beneath with the flashlight. Found nothing but dirt and roots in the marks where the journal had rested for years. He tried the other steps. The front porch stones, the foundation corners. Worked through the night, searching every stone that looked old enough to be original. Found nothing. As dawn broke gray and cold, he sat on the porch exhausted and frustrated. His father had said he would know where to look when he was ready. But he had been looking, had searched everywhere that made sense. Maybe he was not ready yet. Maybe there was something else he needed to understand first. Frank arrived at mid-morning with coffee and bad news. He poured 2 cups and handed one to Will. James filed papers with the county court, Frank said. Petition to invalidate your father's will. Claims he was not competent when he wrote it. Will felt his chest tighten. Can he do that? He can try. Court will decide. But it means you will have to defend it. Means lawyers. Means time and money. I do not have money for lawyers, Will said. Frank sipped his coffee. I know a woman in town, Maria Santos, does legal aid work, helps people who cannot afford representation. I talked to her yesterday. She said she would take your case. Why would she do that? Because your grandfather helped her father when no one else would. Mexican immigrant. Could not speak English. Your grandfather gave him a job at the mill. Taught him the work. Treated him fair. Maria remembers. Will looked out at the trees. The web of old debts and old kindnesses stretching across decades. Connecting people who had never met. Creating obligations that outlived the people who made them. I will talk to her, Will said. Frank nodded. Good. Because James is serious about this. He is not going to wait 6 months and hope you fail. He is going to force it. They worked that day finishing the interior walls. Frank showed Will how to hang drywall, how to tape and mud the seams. Slow work that required patience. They did not talk much, just worked in the rhythm they had developed over the past month. The easy silence of 2 men comfortable in each other's presence. That afternoon, a car came up the mountain. Not a truck this time, but a small sedan that bottomed out on the ruts and rocks. A young man got out, maybe late 20s, carrying a camera and a notebook. He walked toward the cabin with the careful steps of someone not used to uneven ground. Will and Frank stopped working and watched him approach. Mr. Carter, the young man called. William Carter? Will set down his tools. That is me. The young man extended his hand. Owen Blake, I write for the county newspaper. I heard about your situation and thought it might make an interesting story. Will did not take his hand. I am not interested in being a story. Owen lowered his hand but did not leave. I understand, but this is human interest. Local man trying to save his family's homestead, fighting against his own siblings to honor his father's wishes. People respond to that kind of thing. Will looked at Frank. Frank shrugged. What do you want to know? Will asked. Just the basics. How long you have been here, what you are trying to accomplish, why it matters. Will considered. What about his siblings and their lawyers and the court case coming? Thought about public opinion and how it might matter when a judge decided whether his father had been competent or not. All right, he said, but I am not going to lie to make it sound better than it is. I would not want you to, Owen said. They sat on the porch and talked while Owen took notes. Will told him about the funeral, about the will, about the 6-month requirement, about his siblings' reaction, about the work he had been doing. He did not mention the journal or the hints about water rights. Some things felt private, personal. Owen photographed the cabin, asked thoughtful questions, seemed genuinely interested rather than just looking for an angle. When he finished, he stood and looked around at the property. This place has good bones, he said. You can see someone cared about it once. My grandfather built it, Will said, after the war. Owen nodded. My grandfather came back from Vietnam. Never talked about it. Worked with his hands the rest of his life. I think that was how he dealt with it. He looked at Will. I think people will understand what you are doing here, why it matters. He got in his car and drove away carefully down the rutted road. Frank watched him go. That could help, he said, or it could make things worse. Will knew he was right, but it was done now. No way to take it back. The article appeared 3 days later. Will drove into town to buy supplies and saw it on the front page of the county newspaper. The headline read, Local Veteran Fights to Save Family Homestead. Below it, a photo of Will standing in front of the cabin, tools in hand, looking weathered and determined. He bought a copy and read it sitting in his truck. Owen had written it sympathetically, told the story straight, quoted Will accurately, mentioned the siblings' legal challenge but did not editorialize. Just presented the facts and let readers draw their own conclusions. Will folded the paper and set it aside, wondered what his siblings would think when they saw it, wondered if it would change anything. He found out the next day. James called. Will had given Owen his number, and the reporter must have printed it because James had it now. The phone rang while Will was working on the porch, and he almost did not answer, but something made him pick up. You are making this personal, James said without preamble, talking to newspapers, trying to turn public opinion against us. I just told the truth, Will said. Your truth, not the whole story. What is the whole story, James? That Dad was sick, confused, that he made decisions he would not have made if he had been thinking clearly. That you took advantage of that. Will felt anger rise but kept his voice level. I was taking care of him. While you were in Connecticut doing whatever you do, I was the one changing his sheets, making his meals, driving him to doctor appointments. And we are supposed to believe you did not influence him? Did not whisper in his ear about how we did not care? How you were the only one who mattered? Believe what you want, Will said. But I am not signing anything. I am not leaving. And I am going to finish these 6 months. James was quiet for a moment. Then, you are going to lose everything. The lawyer fees alone will bankrupt you. And when the court rules against you, you will have nothing. Then I will have nothing, Will said. But at least I will know I did not quit. He hung up, stood on the porch with the phone in his hand, heart pounding. It was the first time he had stood up to James like that. The first time he had not apologized or backed down or tried to smooth things over. It felt terrifying and liberating in equal measure. That afternoon, cars started arriving. First one, then two, then a steady stream. People Will did not know. Townspeople who had read the article, who had known his grandfather or his father, who wanted to help. They brought food, supplies, offers of labor. An elderly woman named Betty who ran the diner in town showed up with casseroles and bread. Said his grandfather used to eat lunch at her place every Saturday. Never tipped less than 50%, even during the hard times. A carpenter in his 60s brought lumber. Said Will's grandfather had given him his first job out of high school, taught him the trade. Others came with stories, with memories, with the accumulated weight of decades of small kindnesses repaid. By the end of the day, Will had enough food to last 2 weeks and enough materials to finish the major repairs. Frank stood beside him, watching the last car drive away. "This is what your grandfather built," Frank said. "Not just the cabin. This." He gestured at the mountain, at the town below, at the web of connections that had brought all these people to this remote place. He built goodwill, built a reputation that does not disappear when you die. It echoes. Will felt something shift in his understanding. His grandfather had not just been hiding from the war. He had been building something, a different kind of life, one based on decency and fairness and the quiet accumulation of respect. And now, 40 years after his death, that was coming back to protect his grandson. The legal motion hearing was scheduled for early March. Maria Santos met with Will twice to prepare. She was sharp and no nonsense, asking hard questions, making sure he understood what they were up against. "Your siblings will argue your father was not competent," she said. "They will bring medical records, maybe testimony from his doctor. We need to prove he was clear-minded and made this decision deliberately." "How do we do that?" Will asked. "We show planning. We show he came back to this decision multiple times over months. We show he took steps to ensure his competence could not be questioned." She looked at him. "Did your father do anything like that?" Will thought about the letters, about the psychiatric evaluation his father had mentioned, about the fact that he had returned to the attorney multiple times to refine the language. "Yes," he said. "He planned this carefully." "Good, then we have a chance." The hearing was held in the county courthouse, a brick building in the center of town that had stood since before the Civil War. Will arrived early with Maria. Frank came to sit in the gallery. A few of the townspeople who had brought food and supplies came too. Quiet support. James, Patricia, and David sat on the other side with their attorney. Expensive suit, briefcase that probably cost more than Will made in a month. The kind of lawyer you hired when you were serious about winning. The judge was a woman in her early 60s with gray hair pulled back severely. She read through the filings without expression, then looked up. "This is a motion to invalidate a will clause based on testator incompetence," she said. "Mr. Harrison, you represent the petitioners?" The expensive lawyer stood. "Yes, Your Honor. We will show that George Carter was suffering from dementia and was not of sound mind when he drafted the contested portion of his will." "Ms. Santos, you represent the respondent?" Maria stood. "Yes, Your Honor. We will show that Mr. Carter was fully competent and acted with clear intention." The judge nodded. "Proceed." What followed was 2 hours of testimony and evidence. James testified that their father had been forgetful, confused at times, unable to manage his own affairs in the final months. Patricia supported his testimony. David added details about medications, about doctor visits, about conversations that did not make sense. Their attorney presented medical records showing a dementia diagnosis, showed prescriptions for memory medications, built a picture of a man whose mind was failing. Then Maria stood to cross-examine. "Mr. Carter, when was your father diagnosed with dementia?" James checked his notes. "February of last year." "And when did he add the clause about the cabin to his will?" James hesitated. "I am not sure exactly." Maria pulled out a document. According to the attorney's records, 18 months before his death. That would be 8 months before the diagnosis. "Does that sound right?" James shifted. "I suppose. And this clause was not added impulsively, was it? According to these records, your father met with his attorney 4 separate times over a 6-month period to refine the language. Does that suggest someone acting on impulse or someone planning carefully?" "He was already showing signs," James said. "We just did not have a diagnosis yet." Maria turned to the judge. "Your Honor, we have evidence that Mr. Carter underwent an independent psychiatric evaluation specifically to establish his competence. This evaluation, conducted by a doctor with no prior relationship to the family, found him fully capable of making legal decisions." She presented the evaluation. The judge read it, then looked at James's attorney. "Mr. Harrison, do you have any evidence that this evaluation was fraudulent or inaccurate?" "No, Your Honor. But we believe the testator's condition deteriorated after the evaluation was conducted." "When was the evaluation done?" the judge asked. Maria answered. 2 months before Mr. Carter died, Your Honor. Well after the will clause was written, but close enough to his death to be relevant." The judge made notes, looked at both attorneys. "Anything else?" Maria called Frank to testify. He explained how George Carter had come to him specifically about the property, had been clear about his intentions, had spoken about his father and about Will and about what he hoped would happen. "He was as sharp as I have ever seen him," Frank said. "Knew exactly what he was doing. Said his other children did not need the cabin. Said Will did. said it would either break him or save him, and he was betting on save. The judge listened without expression. When Frank finished, she looked at Will. "Mr. Carter, do you have anything you would like to say?" Will stood, did not know what he was going to say until the words came out. "My father and I were not close," he said. "I spent most of my life trying to earn his approval and never quite managing it. When he left me that cabin, my first thought was that he was punishing me, giving me something worthless while my siblings got everything that mattered." He paused, looked at his siblings. "But I was wrong. He was giving me the only thing he had that was worth anything. A chance to find out who I am when everything else is stripped away. A chance to do what his father did. To build something with my hands that might save me from what was breaking me inside." He looked back at the judge. "My father was many things. Distant, hard to please. But he was not confused. He knew exactly what he was leaving me. And I am going to honor that. Whether it takes 6 months or 6 years." The judge made more notes, then looked up. "I will take this under advisement and issue a ruling within 48 hours. Court is adjourned." Everyone stood. James and his siblings left quickly without looking at Will. Maria gathered her papers. "You did well," she said. Will nodded, felt empty, exhausted, like he had used up everything he had just to stand there and speak. Frank walked with him out to the parking lot. They stood by Will's truck in the cold afternoon sun. "Whatever happens," Frank said, "you told the truth. That is all you can do." Will drove back to the mountain. The cabin was cold when he arrived. He built a fire and sat watching the flames. Thought about his father, about the careful planning, about the fact that even at the end, even when his mind was starting to fail, he had been thinking about this, about Will, about what he needed. It was the closest thing to love his father had ever given him. He pulled out the journal and kept reading, looking for clues about the spring, about the water rights, about what his grandfather had hidden. June 1960, the company sent someone different today. Friendlier. Said they understood my position, said they respected my desire to protect the land, but asked me to at least consider their offer, showed me numbers, what the water rights would be worth. More money than I could make in 10 lifetimes at the mill. Told him money was not the point. He asked what was. I did not have an answer he would understand. How do you explain to someone that this spring saved your life? That drinking from it every day reminds you that you are still alive? That some things matter more than profit? He left disappointed. I signed papers, though. Legal papers establishing my ownership of the spring rights separate from the land. Attorney said it was important. That way no one could claim later that I did not understand what I had. Put the papers with the deed. Safe place. Someday George might need them. Will stopped reading. Papers with the deed. He had found the deed when he found the journal. But there had been nothing else in that cavity unless. He went outside with the flashlight, examined the hearthstone more carefully, ran his hands along the edges, found a crack he had not noticed before. Not a natural crack, too straight, too deliberate. He worked the pry bar into it. The stone shifted differently than before, not lifting out but sliding to the side. Underneath was another cavity, deeper, lined with metal to keep out moisture. Inside was a small waterproof box. Will pulled it out. His hands were shaking. He carried it inside and set it on the floor near the fire. Opened it carefully. Documents. Old paper, but protected. He unfolded them and began to read. Water Rights Grant, issued by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, granting Thomas Carter exclusive rights to the natural spring on his property. Rights transferable to heirs. Rights in perpetuity. Below that, survey maps showing the spring and the watershed. Technical documents Will did not fully understand. And at the bottom, a modern appraisal dated 5 years earlier, the same time his father had bought the property back. Will read the appraisal 3 times to make sure he understood. The spring produced some of the cleanest water in the state, located in an area with limited other sources. With population growth and water scarcity, the rights were valued at between $3 and $5 million. His father had left him a fortune, not in the land, in the water. He sat back, stunned. This was what his siblings were fighting for, or would be if they knew. Did they know, had his father told them? A thought struck him cold. 5 years ago, his father had bought back the property. That same year, according to county records Maria could check, what had James been doing? Will pulled out his phone, called Maria Santos, even though it was late. She answered on the 3rd ring. I found something, Will said, something important. I need you to look into my siblings' business activities. Specifically around 5 years ago. when my father bought back this property. What am I looking for? Maria asked. Anything related to water rights, development, survey work, anything that suggests they knew what this land was worth. I will start digging tomorrow, Maria said. But Will, if they knew and tried to pressure you into signing it over without telling you the value, that is not just unfair. That is fraud. Will felt cold settle in his stomach. I need to know. She hung up. Will sat holding the documents. Outside, night was falling, the temperature dropping. He added wood to the fire and thought about what this meant. His father had not left him a ruin, had not left him a test. He had left him an inheritance that could change his life, could give him security he had never had, could prove to everyone that he was not the failure his siblings thought he was. But his father had also hidden it, had made Will work for it, had required 6 months of endurance and struggle before revealing the truth. Why? Will thought he understood. The money did not matter if you had not earned the right to it, had not proven you could survive without it. His grandfather had refused to sell because he understood some things should not be bought. His father had hidden the value because he wanted Will to choose this place for the right reasons. Not for profit, for survival, for healing, for the work itself. Will folded the documents and put them back in the box. Put the box in a safe place. Tomorrow he would figure out what to do with this knowledge. Tonight he just sat by the fire and thought about his grandfather drinking from that spring every day. Thought about water as salvation. Thought about the difference between price and value. The ruling came down the next morning. The judge had decided in Will's favor. The will clause would stand. James's motion was denied. Maria called to tell him, "Your father's planning was too thorough, too deliberate. The judge could not find any basis to question his competence." Will felt relief wash over him. "Thank you." "There is something else," Maria said. "I looked into your siblings' activities. James and David have a business partnership. Real estate development. They filed incorporation papers 2 years ago." Will's chest tightened. "What kind of development?" Maria paused. "They specialize in water rights acquisition. They buy properties with springs or wells, develop the water rights, sell them to bottling companies." Will closed his eyes. They knew, had known for years. That was why James had been asking their father about the property, why they had both been so determined to get him to sign it over. "But how did they find out?" Will asked. "The documents were hidden. My father never told anyone." Maria was quiet for a moment. "Then I found something interesting in the county records. 5 years ago, right after your father bought back the property, someone hired a private surveyor to assess it. The surveyor filed a report with the county as required by law. That report mentioned significant spring activity and potential commercial value." "Who hired the surveyor?" Will asked, though he already knew. "The client name was redacted for privacy," Maria said. "But the billing address was your brother James's law firm. He must have been researching the property even then, probably trying to convince your father to sell. When your father refused and left it to you instead, James and David planned to buy it cheap from you, make it look like charity while knowing exactly what they were getting." Will felt cold understanding spread through him. "They were going to steal it from me." "Looks that way," Maria confirmed. "The question is what you want to do about it." Will thought about his options. He could expose them, could file charges, could destroy their reputations, could take everything from them the way they had tried to take everything from him. Or he could just hold on to what was his and let them live with the knowledge that they failed. "I want to keep the property," he said. "I want to finish the 6 months. After that, we will see." "Understood," Maria said. "But Will, be careful. If they know you found the water rights documents, they might try something else." "Like what?" "I do not know. But desperate people do desperate things. Just be aware." She hung up. Will stood in the cabin looking at the walls he had repaired, the floor he had reinforced, the windows he had replaced. All of it earned, all of it his. He was not going to let anyone take it from him. That night, he heard vehicles on the road. Multiple engines, coming fast. He went to the window and saw headlights, 3 trucks. They stopped in the clearing and men got out, 6 of them. Will did not recognize any of them. They walked toward the cabin. One of them carried something, a can. Even from inside, Will could smell it, gasoline. He grabbed his phone and called Frank, then 911. But he knew response times up here. The sheriff was 40 minutes away on a good day, Frank maybe 20. The men outside could do a lot of damage in 20 minutes. He opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. The men stopped. "Can I help you?" Will asked, keeping his voice steady. One of them stepped forward, older, maybe 50, wearing work clothes and a cold expression. "You are trespassing on private property," he said. Will almost laughed. "This is my property." The man shook his head. "Your brother sent us, said this structure is condemned, said we are supposed to tear it down before someone gets hurt." "My brother does not have that authority." The man shrugged. "He paid us. That is all the authority we need." He gestured to the others. They moved toward the cabin. Will stepped down from the porch, putting himself between them and the door. "You are not touching this place," he said. The man with the gasoline can smiled. "That is not up to you anymore." He moved forward. Will did not think, just acted. Stepped into the man's path and shoved him hard. The can went flying, gasoline splashing across the ground. The man stumbled back, surprised. The others moved in. Will felt hands grab him. He fought, threw punches, connected with something solid. Heard someone grunt, but there were too many. They dragged him away from the cabin, threw him to the ground. One of them kicked him in the ribs. Pain exploded through his chest. He curled up, trying to protect himself. Another kick, another. He tasted blood. Through the pain, he heard engines. More vehicles. Headlights swept across the clearing. The men stopped. Will looked up through blurred vision. Frank's truck. And behind it, 5 more trucks. 10 more, people from town. The carpenter, the diner owner, others he did not know. They got out and walked toward the clearing. Frank stood at the front, a shotgun in his hands. "You boys need to leave," he said quietly. "Now." The man who had ordered the attack looked around, counted the numbers, realized he was outnumbered. "This is not over," he said. "Yes, it is," Frank replied. "Get out of here before the sheriff arrives." The men got back in their trucks and left. Frank knelt beside Will. "Can you stand?" Will tried. Pain shot through his ribs, but he got to his feet with Frank's help. "They were going to burn it," Will said. "I know, but they did not. And they are not going to get another chance." The other townspeople gathered around. Someone handed Will water. Someone else offered to drive him to the hospital. He refused, just wanted to go inside, to make sure the cabin was untouched. Frank helped him up the porch steps. They went inside together. The cabin was exactly as Will had left it, safe, whole, his. He sat down by the fire, pain radiating through his chest with each breath. Frank sat beside him. "Your brother sent those men," Frank said. "You know that." "I know. You should press charges." Will thought about it, about James and David and their development company, about the years of dismissal and contempt, about tonight. "No," he said finally. "I just want them to know they lost." Frank nodded. "Fair enough." They sat in silence as the other townspeople checked the property, made sure nothing was damaged. One by one, they came inside to tell Will they were leaving, that they would come back tomorrow, that they would make sure this did not happen again. When they were gone, Frank stood to leave. "Your grandfather would be proud," he said, standing up like that. "I did not do much good," Will said. "They would have burned it if you had not come. But I did come. We all did. That is the point. You are not alone in this." Frank left. Will sat by the fire, every breath painful, every movement an effort, but alive, still here, still standing. He looked around the cabin at everything he had built, everything he had saved, thought about the water rights documents hidden safely away, about the future they represented, about the choice still ahead of him. Keep this place and the fortune that came with it, or find another way. His grandfather's words echoed in his mind. Some things are not for sale. Will closed his eyes and let the fire's warmth wash over him. Tomorrow he would figure out what came next. Tonight, he just needed to survive. And he had. That was enough. Will woke to pain. It had settled into his ribs like something living, breathing with him, expanding and contracting with each shallow attempt to fill his lungs. Morning light filtered through the cabin windows, pale and cold. He lay on the floor near the stove, exactly where he had collapsed the night before after Frank left. Moving took effort. He pushed himself up slowly, every muscle protesting. His shirt was stiff with dried blood. When he lifted it, the bruising across his ribs had deepened overnight, dark purple spreading into black, the imprint of boots visible in the discolored flesh. He stood carefully, testing his weight. Nothing felt broken, but everything hurt. He walked to the bucket of water he kept near the stove and splashed his face. The cold shocked him awake. In the cracked mirror he had hung on the wall, a stranger looked back. Gaunt, weathered, older than 56 had any right to look. He thought about going into the hospital. Frank had offered to drive him the night before, But hospitals meant questions. Questions meant police reports. Police reports meant his siblings would know their hired men had failed, would try something else. Better to just keep moving, keep working. Pain was temporary. The cabin needed to be finished. He made coffee on the camp stove and drank it black, standing at the window looking out at the clearing. The ground where the gasoline had spilled was still dark. The snow stained and melted in that spot. Evidence of how close he had come to losing everything. Frank arrived at mid-morning with supplies and concern. He took one look at Will's face and set down the lumber he was carrying. "You need to see a doctor," Frank said. "I am fine." "You are not fine. You can barely stand up straight." Will moved to prove him wrong and felt something shift in his chest, pain sharp enough to make him gasp. He steadied himself against the wall. Frank walked over and lifted Will's shirt without asking permission. Looked at the bruising, shook his head. Could be broken ribs. Could be internal bleeding. "You are going to the hospital." "I do not have time for that." "You do not have a choice." Frank pulled out his phone. "I am calling an ambulance." "No," Will said. "Too much attention. I will drive myself." Frank looked at him for a long moment, then reached into his pocket and pulled out his truck keys. "I am driving you, and I am not asking." They made the 40-minute drive to the county hospital in silence. Will stared out the window at the passing landscape. Mountains giving way to foothills, giving way to valley. The world opening up in ways it never did on the mountain. Too much space. Too many people. The emergency room was half full. Frank checked him in while Will sat in a plastic chair, trying to breathe shallowly enough that it did not hurt. A nurse called his name after 20 minutes, took his vitals, asked what happened. "Fell," Will said. The nurse looked at him with an expression that said she knew he was lying, but was not going to push. "From how high?" "Does it matter?" She made a note on her chart. "The doctor will want x-rays." They moved him to a room, took images of his chest. The doctor was young, maybe 40, with tired eyes and the efficient manner of someone who had seen too much. She clipped the x-rays to a light board and studied them. "3 cracked ribs," she said. "No breaks, no pneumothorax. You are lucky." "Does not feel lucky," Will said. She turned to look at him. "The bruising pattern suggests multiple impacts. Blunt force trauma. If you were assaulted, we are required to report it." "I fell," Will repeated. The doctor held his gaze, then nodded slowly. "You fell multiple times on someone's boot." She wrote something on her chart. "I am keeping you overnight for observation. The ribs will heal on their own, but I want to make sure there are no complications. And I want cardiology to look at you." "Why cardiology?" "Your EKG is showing abnormalities." "Could be stress, could be something else. Better to check." Will wanted to refuse, to walk out, to get back to the cabin before his siblings found out where he was. But the pain in his chest was worse than it had been that morning, and he was tired. Exhausted in a way that went deeper than the physical. "All right," he said. They admitted him to a room on the 3rd floor. Small, sterile, a window looking out at the parking lot. The admissions clerk explained the billing as she processed his paperwork. His veterans' benefits would cover most of the hospital costs through the VA system, a small mercy from a system that had failed so many others. He would still owe some out of pocket, but nothing he could not eventually manage with payment plans. Frank stayed until the nurses told him visiting hours were over, promised to check on the cabin, to make sure no one came back. Will lay in the hospital bed watching the light fade outside. The IV in his arm dripped steadily. Pain medication had dulled the worst of the ache but left him foggy, disconnected. He drifted in and out of sleep, dreams mixing with memory until he could not tell which was which. The cardiologist arrived the next morning. Dr. Raymond Chen, older than the ER doctor, maybe 55, with graying hair and the calm manner of someone comfortable with difficult conversations. He pulled up a chair beside the bed. "Mr. Carter, I am going to be direct with you. Your heart is not healthy." Will blinked, trying to focus through the medication haze. "What does that mean?" "It means you have significant cardiovascular disease. Your arteries are partially blocked. Your ejection fraction is low. You are at high risk for a major cardiac event." "A heart attack," Will said. "Yes." Dr. Chen pulled out a tablet and showed Will images. "Your tests show this has been developing for years, probably accelerated by stress, poor diet, physical overexertion." "I have been working hard," Will said. "Too hard. Your body is running on empty. If you do not make changes, this will kill you. Maybe not today, maybe not this month, but soon." Will stared at the ceiling. "What kind of changes?" Medication, diet, exercise that is not 12 hours a day of manual labor in freezing temperatures. Rest, stress reduction. He paused. I read the newspaper article about you. I know what you are doing up on that mountain. Then you know I cannot stop. Why not? Because I have 3 more months to finish. Because if I stop now, I lose everything. Dr. Chen leaned back in his chair. I served in Desert Storm, Marine Corps. I know about missions, about objectives that have to be completed no matter what. But I also know the difference between completing a mission and dying for one. This is not the same. Is it not? You are alone on a mountain working yourself to death to prove something to people who do not care. That sounds like dying for a mission to me. Will felt anger rise. You do not understand. Then help me understand. What are you actually trying to accomplish? Will started to answer, stopped. The words he had been telling himself for months suddenly felt hollow. He was finishing what his father started. He was honoring his grandfather's legacy. He was proving he was not weak. But underneath those reasons was something else, something he had not wanted to look at directly. He was hiding, just like his grandfather had, using work and isolation to avoid dealing with the grief that had been eating him alive for 3 years. I do not know, Will said quietly. Dr. Chen nodded. That is the first honest thing you have said since I walked in here. He stood. I am going to keep you another day for monitoring. Use that time to think, really think, about whether winning this fight is worth dying for. He left. Will lay in a hospital bed staring at nothing. Outside the window, clouds moved across the gray sky. Life continued whether he was part of it or not. That afternoon, James came to visit. Will heard the footsteps in the hallway and knew before seeing him, knew the confident stride, the way James moved through the world like he owned it. The door opened and his older brother stepped inside. James looked older than Will remembered. The silver in his hair had spread. Lines had deepened around his mouth and eyes. He wore a suit, but it hung on him differently, as if he had lost weight he could not afford to lose. They looked at each other for a long moment. Then James pulled the visitor chair close to the bed and sat. I heard you were here, he said. Will waited. I also heard what happened. The men, the gasoline. James looked down at his hands. I did not send them. Will studied his brother's face, saw something he had not seen before. Not guilt, exactly, but something close to it. David did, James continued. Hired them without telling me. I found out after. He paused. I fired him from the partnership. Why are you telling me this? Because I am tired, James said. He looked up, met Will's eyes. I am tired of fighting you. Tired of pretending I am doing this for the right reasons. Tired of lying to myself about what this is really about. What is it really about? James was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was different, less controlled, more honest. I spent my whole life trying to be what Dad wanted, important, successful, better than where we came from. I made a lot of money, built a career, got everything I thought mattered. He laughed, but there was no humor in it, and I am miserable. Divorced twice, my kids do not talk to me. I manage millions of dollars, and I cannot sleep at night without pills. Will did not know what to say to that. Then you show up, James continued. Living in a falling down cabin, working yourself half to death for nothing anyone else would value. And you seem, he searched for the word, content. Like you found something I have been looking for my whole life and did not even know I was missing. I am not content, Will said. I am just stubborn. Maybe. Or maybe you figured out what Dad never could. That success is not about what you own. It is about what you can endure. James stood, walked to the window, looked out at the parking lot. I am dropping the lawsuit, he said. Patricia already agreed. David can fight it alone if he wants, but without the two of us, he does not have a case. The cabin is yours. Will felt something shift in his chest, not relief, something more complicated. Why, he asked. Because you were right. Because Dad wanted you to have it. Because I am tired of being the villain in a story that should not have villains. James turned back to face him. And because watching you nearly kill yourself to save that place made me realize I have never cared about anything that much. Never let myself. He walked to the door, stopped with his hand on the frame. For what it is worth, he said, I am sorry. For all of it. Then he was gone. Will lay in the bed trying to process what had just happened. His brother had apologized, had given up the fight, had handed him everything he had been working toward. So why did it feel like he had lost something instead of won? The question followed him through the afternoon, through the dinner he barely touched, through the evening as nurses came and went, checking vitals, adjusting medication. Through the long night when sleep would not come despite the exhaustion pulling at him, Dr. Chen's words kept circling back. What are you actually trying to accomplish? He had thought he was fighting to save the cabin, to honor his father's wishes, to prove he was not the weak one. But maybe he had been fighting to avoid something else, to avoid dealing with the fact that Karen was gone, that his parents were gone, that he was 56 years old and alone and had no idea how to be anything other than useful to people who needed him. The cabin had given him purpose, had given him somewhere to pour all the grief and anger and fear. But purpose was not the same as healing. Working yourself to death was not the same as living. Morning came gray and cold. Dr. Chen returned to check on him. How are you feeling? He asked. Confused, Will admitted. About what? About whether I am doing this for the right reasons. About whether any of it matters. Dr. Chen pulled up the chair again. Let me tell you something. When I came back from the Gulf, I was a mess. PTSD, anxiety. Could not adjust to civilian life. I worked constantly, took every shift I could, told myself I was helping people, and I was. But really, I was just running. What changed? My wife left me, took our daughter, said I was never present even when I was in the room. That broke me, made me realize working yourself to death is not the same as being alive. What did you do? Therapy, medication. Started actually dealing with what the war had done to me instead of just running from it. He looked at Will. You are running too, and I get it. After what you have been through, running makes sense, but eventually you have to stop. I do not know how, Will said quietly. Start by asking yourself what you actually want, not what you are trying to prove, not what you are trying to avoid. What do you want your life to look like? Will did not have an answer. Dr. Chen stood. I am releasing you today. Your ribs will heal, but your heart needs attention. Real attention. I am referring you to a cardiologist in town. I am also recommending therapy. You do not have to take either recommendation. But if you want to survive the next year, I strongly suggest you do. He left. Will got dressed slowly, every movement painful. Frank arrived to drive him back to the mountain. They did not talk much on the drive. Frank could tell something had shifted, but was wise enough not to push. When they arrived at the cabin, everything was exactly as Will had left it. The walls he had repaired, the roof he had replaced, the floor he had reinforced, all of it still standing, still his. He went inside and sat by the cold stove, built a fire, watched the flames catch and grow. Outside, the mountain was silent except for the wind in the trees. For the first time in months, Will let himself ask the question he had been avoiding. What did he actually want? The days that followed were different. Will still worked, but not with the same desperate intensity. His body would not let him even if he wanted to. The cracked ribs made every movement careful, deliberate. He had to rest more, sit more, think more. Frank came by less often. Not because he was abandoning Will, but because there was less urgent work to do. The cabin was weather-tight, functional, safe enough, the rest could wait. One afternoon, a car came up the mountain. Will watched from the window as a woman got out. She was maybe 50, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and clothes that suggested she worked outside. She looked around at the property, then walked to the door and knocked. Will opened it. Can I help you? Mr. Carter? My name is Anna Petrova. I run the community garden in town. Frank suggested I talk to you about your spring. Will tensed. What about it? She smiled. Not what you are thinking. I am not trying to buy it. I am trying to protect it. She explained that she was part of a conservation group working to preserve natural water sources in the county, that they had heard about the spring on his property, that if he was willing, they could help him establish it as a protected watershed. No development, no commercial use, just preservation. Why would I want to do that? Will asked. Anna looked at him directly. Because some things should not be for sale. Because your grandfather understood that and your father did. And I think you do too. Will studied her, saw honesty in her face, saw someone who understood what mattered. Come in, he said. Let me make coffee. They talked for 2 hours. Anna told him about the Conservation Trust, about how it worked, about the tax benefits and the legal protections, about how he could keep ownership but ensure the spring stayed wild forever. It was exactly what his grandfather would have wanted. When she left, she handed him her card. Think about it. Talk to your attorney. There is no rush. Will stood in the doorway watching her drive away. For the first time since finding the water rights documents, He felt something other than pressure, felt possibility. Not the possibility of wealth, but the possibility of doing something that mattered. That night, he read more of his grandfather's journal, found an entry from 1970. A man from the university came today, wanted to study the spring, said it was ecologically significant, rare, asked if I would allow researchers to come. Told him yes, some knowledge is meant to be shared. Some places are meant to be protected, not owned, protected. Will closed the journal, thought about his grandfather, about his father, about the choices they had made and the reasons behind them, about legacy and what it actually meant. He thought about James, about the confession in the hospital room, about a man who had everything and felt empty, about success that destroyed the person achieving it. He thought about Dr. Chen, about running versus healing, about the difference between working yourself to death and actually living. And he thought about himself, about Karen, about the 3 years since her death that he had spent in a kind of fog, moving from job to job, town to town, never settling, never grieving, just surviving. The cabin had forced him to stop running, had forced him to sit with the pain, to work through it with his hands, to endure. But endurance was not the end goal, it was just the beginning. The question was what came next. March arrived with warmer air and the first hints of spring. Snow melted in patches, revealing ground that had been hidden for months. Water ran in small streams down the mountain. The spring that fed his property flowed stronger, clearer, the sound of it audible from the cabin on quiet mornings. Will had been on the mountain for 3 months, had 3 more to go to fulfill the requirement. The work was mostly done. The cabin was livable, not comfortable maybe, but safe, solid, a place someone could actually live. The question was whether that someone should be him. He thought about it constantly. Imagine staying here permanently, building a life in this isolation, growing old on this mountain the way his grandfather had. There was appeal in that, simplicity, peace, an escape from a world that had never quite made sense to him. But there was something else, something Dr. Chen had said about the difference between completing a mission and dying for one. Will was not dying anymore. His ribs were healing. His heart was stable on the medication the cardiologist had prescribed. His body was recovering. But was he living? One morning he woke to find Frank's truck in the clearing and Anna's car parked beside it. They were standing near the spring, talking. Will got dressed and walked down to meet them. Frank looked up as he approached. "We were just discussing possibilities." "What kind of possibilities?" Will asked. Anna gestured at the property. "This land could be more than just your home. It could be something for the community. A retreat, a teaching space, somewhere people could come to learn about conservation, about living sustainably." Frank nodded. "Your grandfather used to teach young men carpentry, gave them skills, gave them a chance. You could do something similar. Teach veterans maybe, men coming back from war who need a place to heal." Will looked at the cabin, at the trees, at the spring flowing clear and cold over stones his grandfather had probably touched. "I do not know if I am staying," he said. Frank and Anna exchanged a look. "You do not have to stay to make it matter," Anna said gently. "You could establish the trust, set up the programs, create something that continues whether you are here or not." "Legacy," Frank added. "That is what your grandfather built. Not just a cabin, an idea that some things are worth protecting, worth preserving, worth passing on." Will felt something loosen in his chest, the weight he had been carrying, the sense that he had to choose between staying and failing, between enduring and giving up. Maybe there was a third option, creating something bigger than himself, something that honored his grandfather and his father and the mountain that had saved him. And then choosing what came next based on what he actually wanted, not what he was trying to prove. "I will think about it," he said. They left him alone with his thoughts. He walked the property line, something he had started doing in the evenings, marking the boundaries, understanding what was his, not in terms of ownership, but in terms of responsibility. The sun was setting when he returned to the cabin. He built a fire and sat watching the flames, pulled out his phone and stared at it for a long time. Then he called Maria Santos. "I want to establish the Conservation Trust," he said, "and I want to talk about setting up programs. For veterans, for people who need this place the way I needed it." Maria was quiet for a moment. "That is a beautiful idea, Will. Can you help me set it up legally?" "Absolutely. We can start the paperwork this week." "Thank you," Will said. He hung up, sat in the silence, made another call. This one harder. James answered on the third ring. Will, I want to talk, Will said. About everything, about Dad, about what happened, about moving forward. I would like that, James said quietly. Can you come to the cabin next weekend? I will be there. Will ended the call, felt something shift, not forgiveness exactly, but the beginning of it, the willingness to try. He stood and walked to the window. Outside, stars were appearing in the darkening sky, the same stars his grandfather had looked at, the same stars that would be there long after Will was gone. He had survived the winter, had proven he could endure, had discovered what his father wanted him to find. Not just the water rights, not just the cabin, but himself, the parts that were still whole underneath all the grief and loss. Now came the harder part, figuring out what to do with that knowledge, how to live instead of just survive, how to build something that mattered. He did not have all the answers yet, but for the first time in years, he was asking the right questions. And that felt like enough. Spring came to the mountain slowly, carefully, like something that had learned not to trust promises. Snow retreated upward toward the peaks, leaving behind ground that steamed in the warming sun. Ice broke on the streams with sounds like glass shattering. Birds returned, tentative at first, then filling the mornings with calls Will had forgotten existed during the long silence of winter. He marked the days now, not obsessively but with awareness. April became May. May stretched toward June. The 6-month deadline approached like a finish line he no longer felt the need to cross at a sprint. The cabin stood complete, not perfect but whole. The roof no longer leaked. The walls held back the wind. The floor was solid underfoot. Heat stayed in at night. Light came through windows that had been replaced with care. It was a home now, not a ruin, a place someone could live. The question was who? James came the first weekend in April as promised. He drove up the mountain in his BMW, bottoming out on the ruts, arriving looking slightly shaken. Will watched from the porch as his brother got out and stood looking at the cabin with an expression that was hard to read. They had not spoken beyond that brief call from the hospital, had not worked through the decades of distance and resentment. Will did not know what to expect, did not know if reconciliation was even possible, or if they were just going through motions because it seemed like what they should do. James walked toward the porch slowly, stopped at the bottom of the steps Will had rebuilt. Can I come up? He asked. It is your cabin too, Will said. Technically. James climbed the steps. They stood facing each other. Two brothers who barely knew each other, despite sharing blood and history. You did this, James said, gesturing at the structure. All of this. Most of it. Frank helped. People from town. James nodded, walked to the edge of the porch and looked out at the view, the valley stretching away below. Mountains rising in the distance, the kind of vista that made human concerns feel small. I have been thinking about what I said in the hospital, James began. About being tired, about being miserable. He paused. I meant it. Every word. Will waited. I spent my whole life running from this, James continued. From Dad's distance. From the idea that we came from nothing. From the mountain. He turned to face Will. And I thought I was successful. Thought I had won. But all I did was trade one kind of emptiness for another. What are you trying to say? I am trying to apologize. For everything. For how we treated you. For the lawsuit. For David and what he did. For not seeing that you were the only one of us who actually understood what mattered. Will felt something tighten in his chest. Understanding what mattered did not make it easier. I do not need an apology, Will said. I just need to know if we can move forward. James had considered this. Can we? I do not know. But I am willing to try. They went inside. Will made coffee on the wood stove. They sat at the small table Will had built from salvaged lumber. Drank in silence for a while. Then James started talking. Really talking. About his marriages. About his children who would not speak to him. About building a career that meant nothing and acquiring wealth that brought no joy. About waking up at 3 a.m. in an empty house wondering what the point of any of it was. Will listened. Did not judge, just listened. When James finished, Will shared his own story. About Karen. About the 3 years after she died when he had just been going through motions. About how the cabin had forced him to stop running and actually deal with the grief. About discovering that survival was not the same as living. We are both broken, James said finally. Just in different ways. Maybe, Will agreed. Or maybe we are both just figuring out how to be whole. They talked until the light faded. Made simple food. Talked more. slowly, carefully began to know each other, not as the roles they had played in childhood, but as the men they had become. When James left the next morning, he stood by his car for a moment before getting in. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For not giving up on this." He gestured at the cabin, at the mountain. "On any of it. You showed me something I needed to see." "What is that?" "That there are things worth fighting for that have nothing to do with winning." He drove away. Will stood in the clearing watching until the car disappeared down the mountain. Felt something that might have been the beginning of forgiveness. The work on the Conservation Trust moved forward through April and into May. Maria Santos handled the legal details. Anna helped navigate the environmental regulations. Frank contributed practical knowledge about what the property could sustain. They met weekly at the cabin, spread documents across the table, drew up plans, discussed possibilities. The vision took shape slowly. The spring would be protected in perpetuity. No commercial development, no drilling or bottling or exploitation, just preservation. A living example of choosing stewardship over profit. But beyond preservation, there would be purpose. The 40 acres would become a retreat, a place for veterans to come and work with their hands and heal in silence the way Will's grandfather had. The cabin would house them. Frank would teach carpentry and basic construction. Will would teach whatever he knew. Anna would teach about the land, about conservation, about living lightly. They would call it the Thomas Carter Wilderness School, after Will's grandfather, after the man who had understood that some places were meant to heal people, not enrich them. The more Will thought about it, the more right it felt. This was what his father had wanted, not for Will to own something, but for Will to create something, to transform inheritance into legacy. One evening in late May, Anna stayed after the others left. She helped Will clean up the maps and documents, made coffee without asking, sat across from him at the table. "You have been quiet today," she said. "Just thinking." "About what?" "About whether I am doing this for the right reasons. About whether this is what I actually want or just what seems like the right thing to do." Anna studied him. "Those can be the same thing." "Can they?" She smiled. "Sometimes the right thing to do is what you want to do. You just have to be honest about what that is." Will looked at her, really looked, saw a woman who was comfortable with silence, who understood the value of wild places, who did not need him to be anything other than what he was. "What do you want?" he asked. "Right now," she said. "I want to sit here and drink coffee with someone who understands why mountains matter, why spring should run free, why some things are worth more than money." "Just that?" She met his gaze. "That is not nothing." "No," Will agreed, "it is not." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness settled around the cabin. Outside, the spring ran over stones. Wind moved through the pines. The mountain breathed with life that had nothing to do with human needs or wants. Later, when Anna left, Will stood on the porch and watched her taillights disappear down the mountain. Felt something he had not felt since Karen died. Not love exactly, not yet, but the possibility of it. The willingness to consider that his life might include another person. That solitude was a choice, not a sentence. He went inside and read his grandfather's journal, found an entry from 1952, shortly after his grandmother had agreed to marry him. "She asked me today why I live up here, why I do not want a house in town like normal people. I tried to explain about the quiet, about needing space after what the war did, but words are not enough. So I showed her the spring, the way the water comes up clear and cold from deep in the mountain, the way it runs whether anyone is watching or not. Told her some things just are, do not need permission or understanding, just are. She said she understood. I think maybe she does." Will closed the journal, thought about water that ran whether anyone watched, about mountains that stood whether anyone climbed them, about the difference between needing to prove something and simply being. He was learning to just be. June arrived with warm days and cool nights. The 6-month deadline was a week away. Will had fulfilled every requirement, had lived on the property continuously, had made it habitable, had proven whatever needed proving. Maria called to confirm, "You have officially met all conditions of the will. The property is yours free and clear." "Thank you," Will said. "What are you going to do with it?" "I am still deciding." But he was not. Not really. He had known for weeks, maybe longer. The question had just been when to make it official. He called Frank. "Can you get people together? I want to make an announcement." "What kind of announcement?" "The kind that matters." Frank must have heard something in his voice because he did not ask questions, just said he would make it happen. They gathered at the cabin on a Saturday in mid-June. Frank and Anna, Maria, Betty from the diner, the carpenter who had helped repair the roof, Tom and the other men from town who had brought supplies, Owen Blake, the reporter, even James, who had driven up from Connecticut specifically for this. Patricia came too. She had called a week earlier, tentative, apologetic. Said she wanted to see what Will had done, wanted to understand. He had said yes. Watched her arrive in a rental car, picking her way across the uneven ground in shoes not meant for mountains. David had not been invited. Some bridges could not be rebuilt. Will stood on the porch looking at the small crowd gathered in the clearing. 15 people, maybe 20. Not many by most standards, but enough, more than enough. He did not have a speech prepared. Had thought about writing something but decided against it. Words from the heart did not need rehearsal. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice carried in the mountain quiet. "I know this is a long drive for most of you, but I wanted you here for this." He paused, looked at the faces looking back at him. 6 months ago, I came to this mountain with nothing. No plan, no hope, no idea what I was doing. I was broken, lost, running from grief I did not know how to face. My father left me this place and I thought it was punishment. Thought he was giving me something worthless, while my siblings got everything that mattered. Several people nodded. They knew this story, had read it in the newspaper, had heard it in town. But I was wrong, Will continued. This place was not punishment. It was not even a test. It was a gift. The only gift that mattered. A chance to stop running. To face what was breaking me. To learn that I did not need anyone's approval to have value. He looked at James, at Patricia. They were listening with expressions he could not quite read. "My grandfather built this cabin to save himself from what war did to him. My father gave it to me so I could save myself from what grief did to me. And it worked. Not because the cabin is special, but because it demanded everything I had. Demanded I show up every day. Demanded I choose to stay even when staying was hard." He walked down the steps, stood in the clearing with the people who had helped him. "I found something here beyond the cabin. I found water rights worth millions of dollars. Found proof that this land has value the world would measure in money. My siblings wanted that value. Wanted to turn this mountain into profit." He saw some people shift uncomfortably. Saw James look down. "I do not blame them," Will said. "Money is how the world teaches us to measure worth. But my grandfather knew different. He knew some things should not be for sale. Some places should not be owned. They should be protected, preserved, shared." He pulled out documents from his jacket, the ones he had signed earlier that week with Maria. "I am donating the water rights to the Pennsylvania Conservation Trust. The spring will be protected forever. No one can develop it. No one can sell it. It will run free the way it was meant to." Silence. Then Frank started clapping. Others joined. The sound echoed off the mountains. Will held up a hand. "There is more. The cabin and 40 acres will become the Thomas Carter Wilderness School. A place for veterans to come and heal. To work with their hands. To learn that survival is not the same as living. Frank will run the carpentry program. Anna will teach conservation. Anyone who wants to help is welcome." More applause, louder now. "And me?" Will said. "I am not staying." The applause stopped. People looked confused. "This place saved my life," Will explained. "But staying here forever would mean hiding. Would mean using this mountain as an escape instead of a teacher. My grandfather came here because he needed to. Stayed because he chose to. I needed to come here too. But I do not need to stay." "What will you do?" someone asked. Will looked at Anna, saw understanding in her face. "I am going to live," he said simply. "Going to get an apartment in town. Going to teach at the school when they need me. Going to have coffee with friends. Going to let myself care about people again. Going to stop running and actually be present." He looked at James and Patricia. "Going to try to know my family. The ones who are willing. Going to forgive. Going to move forward. Going to choose what comes next based on what I want, not what I am trying to prove." The crowd was silent. Then James stepped forward. "Can I say something?" he asked. Will nodded. James looked at the people gathered. Then at Will. "My brother spent 6 months on this mountain doing something I could never do. Not because I am not physically capable, but because I was never brave enough to face myself the way he faced himself." He turned to Will. "You showed me what courage actually looks like. It is not about winning. It is about being honest. About choosing what matters over what is easy." He paused, voice breaking slightly. I am proud of you. I should have said that months ago, years ago, but I am saying it now. I am proud to be your brother. Will felt tears sting his eyes, did not try to hide them. Patricia stepped forward too, stood beside James. I am sorry, she said quietly, for all of it, for not seeing you, for not standing up for you. You deserve better. You both did what you thought was right, Will said. I am not angry anymore. I am just tired of carrying it. Then put it down, Patricia said. We all put it down. Will nodded, felt something release, something he had been holding for so long it had become part of him. The gathering turned into a celebration. Someone brought food from their truck. Someone else had beer. They ate and talked and laughed as the sun moved across the sky. Stories were shared. Plans were made. The future took shape through conversation and commitment. As evening approached, people began to leave. One by one, they said goodbye, promised to help with the school, promised to stay in touch. The clearing emptied slowly. Frank was one of the last to go. He stood with Will on the porch as the sun set behind the mountains. Your grandfather would be proud, Frank said. Not because you are giving this away, because you are choosing something bigger than yourself. Is that what I am doing? That is exactly what you are doing. Frank got in his truck, paused before starting the engine. What are you going to do tonight? He called. Will looked at the cabin, at the door he had repaired, the windows he had replaced, the roof that no longer leaked. Say goodbye, he said. Frank nodded, drove away. Will went inside. The cabin was warm even though the fire had gone out. The last light of day came through the windows and fell across the floor in long rectangles. He walked through the room slowly, touched the walls he had patched, ran his hand along the mantel his grandfather had carved, stood in the space and felt the weight of 6 months settle around him. He had been angry when he arrived, bitter, lost. This place had stripped all of that away, had forced him to rebuild not just the structure but himself, had taught him that he could endure, that he was stronger than he believed, that worthiness was not something earned through approval but discovered through honest work. He pulled out his grandfather's journal one last time, read the final entry, written just days before the heart attack that killed him. June 1985. I am getting old. My body reminds me every morning, but my mind is clear. I think about this mountain, about the cabin I built here 40 years ago, about the life I lived in this place. Was it enough? Did it matter? No, I think it did. Not because of what I accomplished, but because I survived. Came back from a war that tried to destroy me, built something with my hands, raised a son, lived with honor, protected what needed protecting. Some men measure their lives in money or power or achievement. I measure mine in mornings watching the sun rise over these mountains, in water drunk from the spring, in work done well, in silence earned. If I have one regret, it is that my son never understood this, never saw the value in what I built here. But maybe someday his children will. Maybe someone will come to this mountain and find what I found. Peace, purpose, proof that a man can be broken and still be whole. Will closed the journal, set it carefully on the table where the next person who needed it could find it. He gathered his few possessions, packed them in the duffel bag that had traveled with him for 3 years, looked around one last time. Then he walked out and closed the door behind him. The mountain was silent except for the wind and the water and the birds settling in for night. Will stood in the clearing and breathed it in, the pine scent, the cold air, the vast quiet, everything that had saved him. Thank you, he said to the mountain, to his grandfather, to his father, to whatever force had brought him here and kept him here and taught him what he needed to know. Then he got in his truck and drove down the mountain. 3 months later, the dedication ceremony for the Thomas Carter Wilderness School drew a crowd of over 100 people. State officials, conservation groups, veterans organizations, townspeople, media. Will stood to the side and watched. He was not the center of attention. Anna was giving the main speech about conservation and stewardship. Frank was explaining the programs. Maria was discussing the legal framework that would protect the land in perpetuity. Will was just someone who helped make it happen, and that felt exactly right. James and Patricia had both donated money to the school's endowment, enough to fund operations for years. James said it was the best investment he had ever made. Patricia had volunteered to help with fundraising. They were trying, all of them were trying. After the ceremony, people toured the cabin. It had been restored further. expanded slightly to house 6 veterans at a time. But the core structure remained. The fireplace his grandfather had built, the mantel with its careful carvings, the bones of a place built by broken hands that learned to create instead of destroy. Will walked with Anna away from the crowd. They followed the path to the spring, stood listening to it flow. "You did a good thing," Anna said. "We did a good thing," Will corrected. She smiled, took his hand. They had been spending time together. Careful time, building something that did not rush or demand, just grew. "Are you happy?" she asked. Will thought about his small apartment in town, about the job teaching carpentry at the community college, about the weekly dinners with James and Patricia where they slowly learned to be siblings instead of strangers, about the therapy sessions where he was finally processing Karen's death instead of running from it, about mornings with coffee and conversation with someone who understood silence. "I am," he said. "Not every minute, not perfectly, but yes, that is all anyone can ask for." They walked back to the ceremony together. The school was officially open. The first group of veterans would arrive next week. The mountain would do for them what it had done for Will: offer space to break, space to heal, space to build something from the wreckage. Will looked at the cabin one more time, felt gratitude instead of possession, pride instead of attachment. It was not his anymore. It belonged to everyone who needed it, to the mountain, to the future. His grandfather had built it to save himself. His father had preserved it to save his son. Now it would save others. That was legacy. That was inheritance. Not property, purpose. As the crowd dispersed and people began to leave, Will found himself alone for a moment on the porch. He stood where he had stood that first day 6 months ago, when the cabin had been a ruin and he had been lost and nothing had made sense. He thought about the person he had been then, the grief, the anger, the emptiness. That person felt distant now, not gone, but transformed, rebuilt like the cabin, stronger in the broken places. Frank walked over and stood beside him. "You ever regret it?" Frank asked. "Giving it away instead of keeping it?" "No," Will said. "Keeping it would have meant it owned me. This way I own the choice." Frank nodded. "That is wisdom. Or just stubbornness. Sometimes those are the same thing." They stood together in comfortable silence. Two men who had rebuilt more than a cabin, who had found friendship in shared work and mutual respect. "You know," Frank said after a while, "your grandfather used to say something about mountains and men." "What was that?" "That a mountain does not care if you climb it or not, does not need your attention or your conquest. It just is. And if you are smart, you learn from that. Learn to just be, without needing anything from anyone." Will smiled. "Sounds like him. Sounds like you, too." "Maybe," Will said. "I am learning." Frank left to help pack up chairs. Will stayed on the porch a few minutes longer. Watched the sun begin its descent behind the peaks. Watched light change. Watched shadows lengthen. Watched the mountain be itself without effort or apology. Then he walked down the steps and across the clearing to where Anna waited by her car. "Ready?" she asked. "Ready." They drove down the mountain together. Will looked in the rearview mirror once, saw the cabin getting smaller, saw the trees closing in around it, saw it becoming what it was always meant to be. A place that existed whether he was there or not. A place that would outlast him. A place that mattered. He turned his eyes forward, focused on the road ahead, on the town waiting at the bottom of the mountain, on the life he was choosing to live instead of the one he was trying to escape. 6 months ago, he had come to this mountain with nothing, had been given an inheritance he thought was worthless, had fought to survive it, had discovered it was worth everything. Not in money, in meaning. His father's last gift had not been the cabin or the water rights or the land. It had been the chance to choose, to discover what mattered when everything else was stripped away, to learn that a man's worth was not in what he owned, but in what he was willing to give, what he was willing to endure, what he was willing to become. Will had chosen, had endured, had become someone who understood that inheritance was not about receiving. It was about what you did with what you were given, how you transformed it, how you passed it on. He reached over and took Anna's hand. She squeezed back. The mountain fell away behind them. Life spread out ahead, uncertain, imperfect, beautiful. Will was ready for it. For the first time in years, he was truly ready.